Hey everybody, this is the third section of the chapter, The Relationship of Marxism to Hegel, from Marx and Marxism by Iring Fetscher. I'm reading this section by section on the grounds that this chapter is extremely long, and if I was to make it into a single video for it, it would be multiple hours long, and no one wants to sit through that shit. So, here we are. Section 3. The relationship between Marx and Hegel from the Stalinist viewpoint and the heterodoxy of Lukacs and Bloch. Section A of this section is titled Stalin's Hegel. Since the 1920s, when mainly under Stalin's guidance, Leninism was made the philosophy generally binding on all communists, quote, left deviationism, end quote, has been considered as a risk, which cannot be underemphasized. For the purity of doctrine, and especially among the German Marxists, any intense occupation with Hegel is considered as a suspicious sign of left deviationist trends. The, quote, war on two fronts, end quote, which Mitten announced at Stalin's instigation in 1931 against the right-wing mechanistic deviation and the left-wing, quote, Menshevist idealists, end quote, Hegelians, later led to an increasingly reserved attitude towards Hegel on the part of the official party ideologists. So, there's a footnote and a name I need to look up. So the name that I need to look up first is Mitten, which evidently is a Mark Mitten, who lived from 1901 to 1897, who was a Soviet Marxist-Leninist philosopher, university lecturer, and professor of philosophy faculty of Moscow State University, 1964 to 1968, 1978 to 1985. Mark Mitten was interested primarily in dialectical and historical materialism, the philosophy of history, and the criticism of bourgeois philosophy. There's a section in this piece that says, titled New Philosophy, in the Wikipedia it says New Philosophy, and it says, in the 1920s, a debate raged within Soviet dialectical materialism between the mechanists and the dialecticians of the Deborin school, or Deborin, I'm not sure how to pronounce it actually. Deborin, which was initially victorious. Deborin was initially victorious, but Deborin was criticized by Mitten for, quote, Menshevizing idealism. Mitten led the Red professors in ousting Deborin. Mitten insisted that Deborin lacked party spirit and did not recognize the unity of theory and practice. And praxis. And there's actually a Wikipedia page for the concept of Menshevizing idealism, so I'm going to read that. Menshevizing idealism, also known as Menshevistic idealism, is a term that was widely used in Soviet Marxist literature and referred to the errors committed in philosophy by Iring Fetscher's group. The term was coined by Joseph Stalin in 1930. According to Soviet philosophers, Menshevistic idealism tried to identify Marxist dialectics with Hegel's, divorced theory from practice, and underestimated the Leninist stage in the development of philosophy. So, that's that. Now for the footnote. That's from Mitten's Über die Ergebnisse der philosophischen Diskussion in Unter dem Banner des Marxismus, under the banner of Marxism, Volume 5, 1931, especially 3, the Menshevistic idealism of the Deborin group, and 4, the task of the struggle on the two fronts in philosophy. End footnote. If Hegel was mentioned at all, it was in terms of the officially sanctioned statements by the, quote, classics, end quote, Lenin and Stalin. Alternatively, the dialectical categories of Hegelian logic were dealt with in a purely abstract manner. Since the writings of Marx's youth were considered as, quote, pre-Marxist, end quote, works, it was very difficult to obtain information from them on the true relationship which exists not only on the biographical but also on the objective level between the thought of Hegel and Karl Marx. Footnote. The interpretation of Marxism on the basis of the early philosophical works was particularly stimulated by the publication of the Paris manuscripts, National Economy and Philosophy. One section of the latter was first published in 1931 in the yearbook entitled Unter dem Banner des Marxismus, a critique of Hegelian dialectics and philosophy in general, while a year later the fragment also appeared in the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe and in a selected edition of Marx's works by Landshut Meyer. In 1923, Lukacs and Korsch had been able to base their studies of the young Marx only on the inadequate edition by Mehring, which does, however, include many of the early printed works. It must be remembered that many of Marx's early works were freely obtainable, e.g., Introduction to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, 1843, and On the Jewish Question of 1843, in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbacher, The Misery of Philosophy, 1847, and The Holy Family, 1845, in separate book editions. However, while these early writings tended to move more and more to the center of interest in the Western world, they were played down by Soviet Party orthodoxy as Marx's pre-scientific youthful deviations. The path to an understanding of Marx's later works with the help of his earlier writings was therefore blocked. In his essay published in Le Thème Moderne and referred to below, Lefebvre indicates how fruitful the discussion of Marx had been in party circles after 1945, after the new discovery of the youthful writings, and how greatly this situation had changed under the influence of the Soviet ideology of Stalin and Zhdanov. End footnote. The intellectual situation in the SED, the East German Unified Socialist Party, which is the result of a forced merger between the Social Democratic and Communist parties in 1946, and the area which it controlled cannot be understood without reference to the relationship between Stalin and Stalinism and Hegelian philosophy. Stalin's true attitude to Hegel is already clearly apparent in his first ideological statement in the tract Anarchy or Socialism. Footnote. 1906 to 1907, Werke German edition. I guess that's Stalin's Werke. Where am I? Wikipedia says Anarchism or Socialism is a 1906/1907 work by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. The work sought to analyze anarchism using Marxist methods. Background. The composition of this work was developed in the years following the failed 1905 Russian Revolution. Stalin at this period of time adopted a strong Marxist ideology. The philosophy of anarchism played a significant role in Russian history, and numerous notable Russian anarchists such as Mikhail Bakunin, Emma Goldman, Peter Kropotkin, and Leo Tolstoy. At the time, anarchists in Georgia were engaged in an ideological campaign against Marxists in the Caucasus, and Stalin was made responsible for Bolshevik operations in the Caucasus region. New section, History of Publication. The articles that became Anarchism or Socialism began as a series of newspaper articles written in Georgian. The first 4 articles were published in their original form in the daily Bolshevik newspaper, New Life, published in Tbilisi under the direction of Stalin in July 1906. The series continued to be published in Our Life from 1907 to its closure on the 6th of March 1907, and then in Time in April 1907. New section, Synopsis. The work focuses on Stalin's criticism of the philosophy of anarchism and responses to anarchist criticisms of Marxists. According to Stalin, anarchists had no support among the working classes, but they had some success outside the workers and among petite bourgeois groups. In the work, Stalin refutes the Georgian anarchists who argued that dialectics denied people the ability to, quote, jump out of oneself, end quote, by arguing that, quote, jumping out of oneself, end quote, is a task for wild goats while dialectics serves humans. So that's anarchy or socialism. Back to the text. It is immediately apparent that Stalin already held Hegel to be an out-and-out reactionary philosopher, and that Hegel approved the anarchist appraisal of Hegel as a, quote, philosopher of the Restoration, end quote, while at the same time agreeing that his dialectical method was a scientific and revolutionary discovery. He explains this discrepancy between the basic reactionary attitude and advanced methodology by drawing attention to a number of natural scientists who were also not revolutionaries but made scientific discoveries of great significance. Quote, Mayer and Helmholtz were not revolutionaries, but their discoveries in the area of physics became a fundamental of science. Lamarck and Darwin were not revolutionaries, but their evolutionary method put biological science on the map. Why cannot we admit the fact that in spite of his conservatism, Hegel succeeded in developing the scientific method which is known as dialectics? End quote. Stalin. I'm not sure what Mayer is being referred to. Hermann von Helmholtz, who lived from 1821 to 1894, was a German physicist and physician who made significant contributions to several scientific fields, particularly hydrodynamic stability. The Helmholtz Association, the largest German association of research institutions, is named in Helmholtz's honor. In the fields of physiology and psychology, Helmholtz is known for his mathematics concerning the eye, theories of vision, ideas on the visual perception of space, color vision research, the sensation of time, perceptions of sound, and empiricism in the physiology of perception. In physics, Helmholtz is known for his theories on the conservation of energy and on the electrical double layer, work in electrodynamics, chemical thermodynamics, and on a mechanical foundation of thermodynamics. As a philosopher, Helmholtz is known for his philosophy of science. Ideas on the relation between the laws of perception and the laws of nature, the science of aesthetics, and ideas on the civilizing power of science. So those are some of the people that Stalin is referencing here. Back to the text. This statement clearly shows that Stalin completely failed to recognize the essential difference between natural, scientific, and philosophical, historical, hermeneutic knowledge. For Stalin, the Marxist dialectical method is, quote, scientific, end quote, like any other method of natural science which is external to its content and the personality of the research worker. Footnote. See my lecture, Der Wissenschaftsanspruch des dialektischen Materialismus in Christen oder Bolschewisten. I would, however, no longer subscribe to the position of Richard Vondelband held by me in that publication. End footnote. Stalin's historical appraisal of Hegel is ahistorical and naturally non-quote Marxist, end quote, in the sense of Marx's attempt to, quote, situate, end quote, ideologist. Wolfgang Harrach justly objected against Stalin that Hegel's dialectical method, we have only to think of the category of qualitative jump, was developed precisely in the context of his defense of the historic achievements of the French Revolution. Footnote. just a citation that I'm not really understanding, so I'm not going to even try to read it. But Wikipedia says Wolfgang Harich was a philosopher and journalist in East Germany who lived from 1923 to 1995, a deserter from the German army in World War II and a member of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany. Wolfgang Harich became professor of philosophy at Humboldt University in 1949. Wolfgang Harich was arrested in 1956 and sentenced to 10 years in prison for the, quote, establishment of a conspiratorial counter-revolutionary group, end quote. Wolfgang Harich was released in 1964 after 8 years and rehabilitated in 1990. In 1994, he joined the Party of Democratic Socialism. Wolfgang Harich is preserved in the Protestant Friedhof 3. Oh, is that 3? Is that 3 in German? Der Jerusalems und Neuen Kirchengemeinde, Cemetery number 3 of the Congregation of Jerusalem's Church and for New Church in Berlin-Kreuzberg, south of Hallisches Tor. Back to the text. The Stalinist evaluation of Hegel as a philosopher of Prussian reaction is due on the one hand to an inadequate knowledge of Hegel and on the other to the tendency already apparent in Engels to equate the natural and social sciences. This enables Engels to place Marx on the same plane as Darwin. The view that Hegel was a reactionary already accepted by Stalin in 1906 was further strengthened for understandable propaganda reasons during World War II and was reflected in a reference made by Stalin in 1941 as well as in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. In the latter we find the following entry. Quote, the struggle against materialism was expressed most strongly in the works of Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, whose philosophy embodied the reaction of the aristocracy, end bracket, against the French bourgeois revolution and the French bourgeois materialism of the 18th century. The German philosophers before and after 1800 gave expression to the fear and hatred of the German nobility and the weak and cowardly bourgeoisie which fawned at its feet in face of the revolutionary overthrow of the feudal order in France, end quote. It's from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, published in German in 1953. End footnote. A second feature of Stalin's approach is that Stalin not only detected a radical break in historical development between Hegel on the one hand and Marx and Engels on the other, but also transformed this break into an impassable chasm. The ideological interpreter of Stalin in the final years of Stalin's life, A. Zhdanov, that's what I'm saying, therefore emphasized in June 1947 in his famous criticism of Alexandrov's book, A History of Western European Philosophy, that, quote, Marx and Engels create a new philosophy which is qualitatively different from all preceding ... systems, end quote. Zhdanov. It looks like the Alexandrov that's being referenced is a Georgy Alexandrov, who lived from 1908 to 1961, who was a Marxist philosopher and Soviet politician. I'm not saying any kind of thing that's just like saying like what his philosophy was. It's just kind of all biographical stuff. So I'm not going to read that. The essential difference is not felt to lie in the fact that Marx thought that he found the basis for, quote, realization, end quote, of philosophy in the proletariat and its, quote, revolutionary practice, end quote, but in the, quote, transformation of philosophy into a science, end quote. Marxism therefore becomes a precise analogy of Comte's positivism. The link between Stalinism and the tradition of Engels is demonstrated by a quotation from Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach and the origins of classical German philosophy, which Zhdanov offers in this context. Once we have realized that philosophers search in vain for absolute all-embracing truth, then, Engels argued, quote, the notion of, quote, absolute truth, end quote, which is unattainable in this way and lies beyond the capacity of each individual, will be abandoned, and instead the attainable relative truths will be pursued through the positive sciences and the summarizing of their results by means of dialectical thought, end quote. Engels in Ludwig Feuerbach und der Ausgang der Klasse. Or Ludwig Feuerbach and the Origins of Classical German Philosophy. While Marx still believed that he could, quote, solve this riddle, end quote, in the admittedly limited but central area of socio-historical reality and make the substance of the historical movement completely intelligible through the collective action of the proletariat, here positive science replaces the, quote, intellectual cobwebs, end quote, of philosophy. Philosophy is, quote, abolished, end quote, without first being, quote, realized, end quote, as Marx demanded, but the realization of philosophy signified the concrete liberation of concrete man as opposed to the formal abstract liberation of the spiritualistic citizen in the bourgeois democracy and in Hegel's philosophy of the state. It was not accidental that this realization was forgotten in the ideology of Leninism-Stalinism. While on the one hand Hegel was dismissed as reactionary and his system declared to be altogether a thing of the past, on the other, the practice of the Stalinist era, which has still not come to an end, approximated more and more to the Hegelian ideal interpreted in conservative terms. This approach to Hegel in real life was presumably also one of the unconscious reasons for the simultaneous vociferous rejection of his philosophy. This quasi-Hegelianism can be seen clearly in two areas. On the one hand, the theory itself was removed further and further from the real, practical movement and transformed into a comprehensive abstract Weltanschauung, or worldview. In this system, the Hegelian notion of the spirit was replaced by that of matter. Such a replacing of the basic concepts cannot change much in a dialectical system. The, quote, standing on its feet, end quote, of Hegelianism amounted on closer inspection to a simple change of words. Karl Korsch already described this position as follows in 1931. Lenin wished to, quote, remain a Hegelian at the same time as a Marxist. He pictures the transition from Hegelian idealistic dialectics to the dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels as being in fact a mere replacement of the idealistic philosophy on which Hegel's dialectical method was based by another philosophical system which was no longer, quote, idealistic, but instead, quote, materialistic, end quote, and he seems to have no realization of the fact that such a, quote, materialistic reversal, end quote, of Hegelian idealist philosophy could at best lead only to terminological changes consisting in the fact that the absolute is referred to as quote, matter instead of, quote, spirit. This comment on Lenin is even more true of Stalinism, but if the theory represented an approach towards Hegel in its abandon of the, quote, revolutionary practice, end quote, which in reality never materialized in the form conceived of by Marx, and in its development into a comprehensive contemplative system, on the other hand, the actual Hegelianization in politics was still more far-reaching and astonishing. The Soviet state under Stalin laid claim far more emphatically than Hegel's state to be the, quote, appearing God, end quote, the absolute on earth, end quote. The, quote, freedom, end quote, which it promised its citizens was no more concrete and real than the freedom in an extremely conservative form of Hegelianism. As in the case of Hegel's system, it consisted in the permission granted to all Soviet citizens to identify themselves with the will, automatically assumed to be reasonable, of the Soviet government and the party leadership. The theory of Soviet democracy, which asserts an absolute identity of interest and will between the state and party leadership on the one hand, and the, quote, working population, end quote, on the other, is borrowed, presumably unconsciously, from Hegel's philosophy of right. There is, however, the not inconsiderable difference that, in making this assertion, Hegel was speaking of an idealized state which was not under his control, while Stalin, the dictator, formulates a theory which is highly advantageous for himself and at the same time forbids all criticism of it. The famous French Marxist Henri Lefebvre also drew attention to the strange phenomenon that when the Stalinists were roundly condemning Hegel, and with him the young, quote, Hegelian, end quote, Marx, the Stalinists were themselves in reality even more Hegelian than all the, quote, left-wing deviationists, end quote, together. In Marxism and French Thought, published in the Polish periodical Tworzoch, I don't know how to say it, Henri Lefebvre writes, quote, in fact, the state with Stalin as the state's leader and the party as the state organization is established as the criterion of truth. It became an analogy of Hegel's absolute idea, the purpose, end, and meaning of history which dominates the chain of historical antagonisms without any form of contradiction. While becoming a philosophy and ideology of the absolute state, Marxism degenerated into Hegelianism, and, what irony of history, this happened at the very moment when Hegelianism was officially being thrown out onto the rubbish heap of history, end quote. Henri Lefebvre. Henri Lefebvre traces this, quote, crypto-Hegelianism of Stalin, end quote, back to the theory of the, quote, consciousness lagging behind social existence, end quote, which had already been formulated by the young Stalin. If, in fact, the consciousness of all ordinary citizens lags behind, they must be handed down truths from a distant sphere, which, in the case of Stalin and Hegel, is the sphere of the state, of state officials and party officials who have the privilege of anticipating and pointing the way. This Stalinist theory, in turn, can be traced back to a theory of Kautsky and Lenin, the significance of which was already recognized by Korsch. As early as 1901, Kautsky, in fact, thought that the proletariat on its own was not able to achieve a, quote, socialist consciousness, end quote, and that the, quote, social consciousness, end quote, is, quote, something which is injected into the class war from outside but does not originate from within the class war, end quote. Kautsky. Lenin took up this statement in 1902 in his work What is to be Done and concluded that there was a need for a party organization independent from the mass of the proletariat. The class struggle and the socialist consciousness are turned here by Kautsky and Lenin into parallel but not directly connected lines of development, and the necessarily retarded state of the consciousness of proletarians who are inevitably linked to their direct surroundings is asserted as a self-evident fact. By contrast, Karl Marx had detected a more direct relationship between the theory Karl Marx developed and the real process of social revolution, and defined it as the, quote, general expression of the real historical movement, end quote. From this theory of the innate inability of the proletariat to arrive at a socialist consciousness without the stimulus and leadership of professional revolutionaries with Marxist training, there developed the doctrine of the party as the guardian of true class consciousness, and finally the theory of the Soviet Socialist State as the sole possessor of historical truth. However, the more the concrete Marxist theory of man developing in all his activities and of, quote, revolutionary practice, end quote, was lost sight of, the more vociferously ideologists spoke of concrete reality, and the greater was the emphasis which was placed on the, quote, materialistic character, end quote, of the Marxist-Leninist philosophy. In this situation, there appeared in 1948 and 1951 two important works on Hegel by the leading Marxist philosophers Georg Lukacs and Ernst Bloch. Both Bloch and Lukacs implicitly refuted the Stalinist dogma of the reactionary character of Hegel, and both highlighted the similarities between Hegel and Marx. While Fritz Behrens and Wolfgang Harek, who were both like ideologues in the GDR, enthusiastically joined forces with Lukacs and Bloch and sought to develop their position still further by their own historical works, the party Orthodoxy turned against these two authors with increasing violence, defining Bloch and Lukacs as left-wing Hegelian deviationists. Georg Lukács' position in the Hungarian October Revolution gave the intransigent ideologists of the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, I think that's what SED stands for, the East German Communist Party, the opportunity which they had been looking for to condemn Lukács once and for all. Before considering the most significant and detailed Stalinist polemics directed against Lukács and Bloch, I must outline at least the basic principles of the two works which roused the strongest criticism. B. Lukacs and Hegel, 1948. The Lukacs who wrote his book on Hegel in the 1930s from his exile in the Soviet Union is no longer the Lukacs of 1923. Lukacs has retracted almost all of his early work and sworn fidelity to the doctrine of Engels and Lenin, but Lukacs still cannot deny the fact that Lukacs is an expert in the history of philosophy and general intellectual history and is able to handle with great skill and subtlety a method which the Stalinists assert is the universal key to all sciences. Lukacs then writes a book which, with all its verbosity and patent praise of the official advocates of the Soviet ideology, is nevertheless of real value and interest to the, quote, Western, end quote, reader. Lukacs aims to place Hegel in historical perspective and provide a Marxist explanation of the origins of Hegel's thought, the earliest formulations of which are examined up to the time of the phenomenology of spirit. Lukacs wishes to demonstrate in concrete form the, quote, role which the real contradictions of capitalist society have played in the highest form of bourgeois philosophy, namely the idealistic dialectics of Hegel, end quote, and to explain, quote, how the intellectual reflection of these contradictions in the classical economy of England and the real explosion of these contradictions in the French Revolution have acted on the origins and development of dialectics, and also what good or bad effect has been had by the fact that these French and English real and ideological events have been combined in the form of a dialectical method and idealistic system in the head of a son of Germany, a country which was retarded in economic and social terms, end quote. Lukacs. It can be seen that Lukacs' basic theory is already in direct opposition to the Stalinist theory of the reactionary, anti-revolutionary character of Hegelian philosophy. Although Lukacs' comments are directed in the first instance against the one-sided, quote, bourgeois, end quote, presentation of Hegel as a mystic and irrationalist, as in Glockner, they also shatter the Stalinist legend of Hegel as a notorious reactionary. Lukacs distinguishes a first Republican epoch in Hegel's thought, the, quote, Hellenic utopianism, end quote, of which is directly comparable with some phenomena of the French Revolution. However, the core of his interpretation is the, quote, Frankfurt crisis, end quote, of Hegel, in which Hegel turned away from his utopianism and developed a positive relationship to his own age. In contrast to the theologizing interpretations of this period, Lukacs understands it above all as a consequence of Hegel's confrontation with the rising bourgeois society which Hegel was studying at the time with the help of English economic literature. In Frankfurt, Hegel felt the need to give himself a position appropriate to his talent within bourgeois society and plan his role within it. The collapse of his utopian revolutionary hopes played a decisive part and forced him to adopt a more positive attitude toward the bourgeois society of his age. If in his youth before 1800, when he came to Frankfurt, Hegel was a revolutionary, or at least a reforming critic and utopian, the roots of his realistic, but also quietistic acceptance of reality can be found in his Frankfurt period. Hegel's aim was to understand the essence of this reality of bourgeois society, and the study of national economics helped Hegel to do so. Hegel's biographer, Rosenkranz, states that he prepared at this time a, quote, critical commentary, end quote, on the German translation of Stuart's Science of the State. Which, quote, included magnificent insights into politics and history, end quote, and in which Hegel, quote, fought against the sterility of Stuart's mercantilism with noble pathos and a wealth of interesting examples, seeking to save the human soul in the middle of the competitive system and the mechanism of work and exchange, end quote. Rosenkranz. However close Hegel came to reality, the humanist aspect was not completely absent from his thought. According to Lukacs, the theory of dialectics arose precisely from the tension between the inhuman reality of the capitalist society, which is analyzed in detail in Hegel's humanistic ideal. The origins of dialectical thought are shown through Hegel's notion of, quote, positivism, end quote, and his gradually changing evaluation of this concept. For the young Hegel of 1795, the dominant positive religion, Christianity, is a force which must be combated as it is hostile to and suppresses life. It is in a secret alliance with the despotism of the princes and has nothing in common with the real mental and physical needs of the people. The, quote, people's religion, end quote, of antiquity, which was a cheerful and free expression of a free community, appears on the other hand as the ideal. Hegel's attitude to the positive religion in existing states of his age is generally one of rejection, as he sees them as a basic inhibition against men's free activity. Accordingly, he expects a return to the immediacy of ancient times, to the naive unity between citizen and state, to overcome the fateful split between man and society in the capitalist world. Gradually, however, Hegel develops a more affirmative attitude towards, quote, positivity, end quote. The latter retains, quote, its positive dead form, but at the same time now appears as a necessary product of the social activity of man himself, end quote. The solution to the contradiction between, quote, life, end quote, free socio-political activity in these positive forms is the central problem for Hegel's philosophy of the state and history. In transforming the notion of positivity into a historical category, the concept of labor emphasized by English political economists has an important part to play. Hegel now considers even the elements which appear rigid or dead as the result of social production. Hegel begins to understand that the development of the West since the collapse of the ancient city-states has not merely been a downward process, and that the Middle Ages was not simply a period of decline. Classical antiquity, therefore, loses the character of a standard to be emulated, and is viewed in historical terms. The institutions, religion, or the church, the state, are no longer conceived from the outset as, quote, positive, end quote, structures which are hostile to life, but as structures which only gradually become positive when the social requirements which led to their appearance cease to exist and other social requirements arise instead, to which these, quote, positive forms, quote, end quote, represent an impediment. This placing of the notion of positivism in a historical context finishes up with the special terms, quote, estrangement, end quote, and, quote, alienation, end quote, which Hegel uses after his Jena writings of 1805/06. Lukacs distinguishes three stages in Hegel's use of the notion of, quote, alienation, end quote. 1. The general alienation, which is associated with every form of economic, technical, and social activity. 2. The specifically capitalist form of alienation, which Marx later described as, quote, reification and, quote, fetishism. See the notes on commodity fetishism and capital. 3. A broad philosophical generalization according to which alienation becomes identified with objectivity or objective reality as such. This generalization is made possible by the speculative character of the entire system, in which nature appears as a, quote, alienation, end quote, of the eternal logos, which returns into its own in the consciousness of man, so that the abolition of objectivity in the consciousness becomes the necessary objective of all its development and progressive liberation. This third highest and, quote, mystified, end quote, stage in the notion of alienation is used by Hegel to, quote, overcome, end quote, in a merely ideal manner the contradictions which cannot be abolished in the lower and more real areas of existence. As realist is in the area of socio-historical reality, Hegel knows no utopia, but since at the same time Hegel cannot see beyond the, quote, horizon of capitalism, end quote, and is therefore unable to abolish the contradictions of the horizon of capitalism, contradictions of capitalism in real and practical terms, he develops the, quote, philosophical utopia of the resignation of alienation within the subject, the transformation of substance into the subject, end quote. Lukacs. This, quote, ideological distortion, end quote, is admittedly Hegel's, quote, weakness, end quote, but this ideological distortion is also Hegel's strength because the dominant philosophical utopia makes way for a complete realism, quote, below, end quote. This highest form of reconciliation at the same time relieves Hegel of all moralizing and impotent criticism of the kind which later became characteristic of the radical left-wing Hegelians right through to Max Stirner. Hegel's often cynical realism, expressed, for example, in the aphorism, quote, factories and workshops base their existence on the misery of a class, end quote, corresponds to the pitiless frankness with which, for instance, David Ricardo described the consequences of early industrialism in England. As Marx once said, Hegel's philosophy revealed itself as the only German phenomenon on a par with the advanced manifestations of bourgeois England and France. The picture of the young Hegel which we have now built up shows an astonishing similarity with the development of the young Marx, and the points of similarity directly back up Lukacs' Hegelian interpretation of Marx in the 1920s. Hegel is not only given the merit of recognizing the inner contradictions of the rising capitalist bourgeois society, it is also acknowledged that Hegel showed indirectly the impossibility of finding a solution to these contradictions within this society. Just as the antagonisms of the real bourgeois society lead in Hegel to a purely spiritual realm in which the antagonisms of the real bourgeois society are resolved in a purely spiritual manner, so this society in reality moves forward by producing the proletariat, which becomes the real subject for the concrete abolition of these contradictions. The transition from Hegel to Marx is understood as the path to that realization through which alone philosophy can truly be abolished, end quote, and realized at the same time as the term, quote, Aufheben, end quote, suggests. Footnote. Just how inappropriately orthodox Soviet Marxism interprets the, quote, realization of philosophy, end quote, is clear from a statement by D. Bergner and W. Jahn. Quote, when Marx says that the proletariat could not be transcended without the realization of philosophy, this means that by its revolutionary activity, the proletarian class eliminates bourgeois society because it has recognized the historical necessity of the establishment of a communist society. In other words, the philosophical theory, in the sense of an adequate understanding of historical laws, is, quote, realized, end quote, and becomes revolutionary practice, end quote. Der Kreuzzug der Akademien gegen den Marxismus. What Marx in fact means by philosophy at the point pointed here is stated most clearly by Marx himself, a, quote, theory which explains man as the highest essence of man, end quote, i.e. humanism. The realization of philosophy, therefore, does not mean the practical application of the knowledge of historical laws, but the humanization of the world, for which evidently the, quote, transcending of the proletariat, end quote, is the essential prerequisite. End footnote. Lukacs' Hegel is advanced, enlightened, and bourgeois. Quote, German misery, end quote, is reflected in Hegel only to the extent that German misery prevents the creation of a concrete social utopia and requires instead the creation of a pantheistic spiritualistic utopia. It was precisely the abandon of any utopia in this world, of the kind which the utopian socialists in France established and the achievement of which, for example, Fourier expected, with an incredible lack of realism, to come from the magnificence of leading capitalists, made Hegel's magnificent realism possible. While Lukacs attempted to interpret the development of Hegelian philosophy in the light of historical materialism and at the same time to refute those commentators who turned Hegel into a mystic and romantic, Ernst Bloch followed a different and in some ways opposing aim. Ernst Bloch wanted to invigorate and deepen dialectical materialism, which is always in danger of becoming a mere mechanism, by energetic reference to Hegel and Hegel's, quote, wealth which is still far from exhausted, end quote. Section C. Ernst Bloch's Hegel. 1951. While Lukacs defends Hegel against, quote, fascist and Stalinist, quote, slander and moves Hegel nearer to Marx, Bloch seeks to clarify dialectical materialism through his study of Hegel. Hegel is considered from the outset as a valuable part of the, quote, heritage, end quote, which had to be maintained and lifted onto a higher plane, quote, Aufgehoben, end quote. In dialectical materialism, Bloch therefore abandons the attempt which Lukacs made to arrive at a historico-materialistic explanation of the origins of Hegelian dialectical thought, and seeks instead to make everything which is in the least bit useful in Hegel directly valuable for dialectical materialism. However, Bloch's interpretation of Hegel differs significantly from that of Lukacs. Bloch's Hegel is more German, irrational, and plebeian than Lukacs' version. Bloch reproaches the latter with not making a sufficiently sharp distinction between, quote, advanced mysticism, end quote, and mere obscurantism. The contrast between the two interpretations is clearest in their consideration of Hegel's philosophy of religion, while Lukacs apologizes, as it were, for Hegel's pantheism as a ashamed atheism, an anxious form of atheism conditioned by German misery. Bloch demands that Hegel should be used to save whatever is valuable for atheistic Marxist philosophy in the religious tradition of Christianity. Bloch therefore has more insight into the significance of the purely religious problems in Hegel's thought, as it is well known that he himself was the only contemporary Marxist author to demonstrate and to prove of the religious dimension in Marxism. The entire system forms the object of his commentary on Hegel. I shall simply mention a few characteristic points. Bloch distinguishes three themes of, quote, social and ideological origin, end quote, in the phenomenology of spirit. 1, quote, the theme of the revolutionary ego in the French Revolution, end quote. 2, quote, the theme of sovereign mathematical production of the content of cognition, end quote, which goes back to the tradition of modern philosophy since Descartes. 3, quote, the theme of the beginning of the historical school, end quote, which was not at the outset reactionary, but originated from a, quote, counterblow, end quote, against the alliance between bureaucracy and despotism. These three series of themes are linked together in many ways in the phenomenology, but must be differentiated for any profound analysis. However, the main purpose of the book is to, quote, show how man reaches a real state of self-knowledge through his work and history, end quote, to which Marx had himself already drawn attention. In this context, as in the case of Lukacs, the Hegelian identification of estrangement and alienation is criticized on the ground that it led to a spiritualistic abolition of all objectivity instead of a real abolition of capitalist alienation. Bloch argues here against Hegel with more polemical vigor than Lukacs, and even objects that Hegel was not a proletarian revolutionary, whereas Lukacs considers that Hegel's thought was as advanced as it could be at the time when it was written. Hegel, according to Bloch's objection, quote, behaves as though only the spiritual subject could be the possible center of independent being, and not the subject together with the subject's correct object, in a world having become homogeneous, with men having reached a state of self-awareness, end quote. Perhaps even more than Lukacs, Bloch subscribes to the ideal, which is a dialectical element in the concept of the young Marx, namely the ideal of sane, conscious, and fully developed man in a humanized world. In this context, he even called specifically for a, quote, Marxist anthropology, end quote, and it is not least because of this heresy that he has been criticized and rejected. Bloch devotes special chapters to a discussion of Hegel's relationship with empiricism and dialectical method. His contrast with flat English empiricism and positivism is emphasized, and the same position is noted in Marx. The belief in the power of human reason is defined as a valuable heritage taken over by Marxism from Aristotle, Thomas, Leibniz, and Hegel. For Marx and Hegel alike, there are, quote, gradations in the category of existence, end quote, such as when he attributes a, quote, higher reality to the trends of development in history, end quote, than to, quote, objectified facts, end quote, a thought which, as we have seen, was already developed by Lukacs in History and Class Consciousness. 1923. The dialectical method is also traced back to a whole series of predecessors. Plato, Proclus, Nicholas of Cusa, Jakob Boehme, and Leibniz are mentioned. I don't know who some of these people are, so I have to look them up, so forgive me. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, Proclus of Athens, who lived from 1412 to 1485, was the most authoritative philosopher of late antiquity and played a crucial role in the transmission of Platonic philosophy from antiquity to the Middle Ages. For almost 50 years, Proclus of Athens was head or, quote, successor, end quote, Diadochos of Plato, of the Platonic, quote, Academy, end quote, in Athens. Being an exceptionally productive writer, Proclus composed commentaries on Aristotle, Euclid, and Plato, systematic treatise in all disciplines of philosophy as it was at that time, metaphysics and theology, physics, astronomy, mathematics, and ethics, and exegetical works on traditions of religious wisdom, Orphism, and Chaldean oracles. Proclus had a lasting influence on the development of the late Neoplatonic schools, not only in Athens, but also in Alexandria, where his student Ammonius became the head of the school. In a culture dominated by Christianity, the Neoplatonic philosophers had to defend the superiority of the Hellenic traditions of wisdom, continuing a movement that was inaugurated by Iamblichus, 4th century, and the charismatic figure of Emperor Julian, and following the teaching of Syrianus. Proclus was eager to demonstrate the harmony of the ancient religious revelations, the mythologies of Homer and Hesiod, the Orphic theogonies, and the Chaldean oracles, and to integrate them in the philosophical tradition of Pythagoras and Plato. Towards this end, his Platonic theology offers a magisterial summa of pagan Hellenic theology. Probably the best starting point for the study of Proclus's philosophy is the Elements of Theology, with the masterly commentary by E.R. Dodds, which provide a systematic introduction into the Neoplatonic metaphysical system. So that's Proclus. Nicholas of Cusa. According to Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Nicholas Cusanus, or Cusanus, Nicholas of Cusa, says, arguably the most important German thinker of the 15th century, Nicholas of Cusa, who lived from 1401 to 1464, was also an ecclesiastical reformer, administrator, and cardinal. His lifelong effort was to reform and unite the universal and Roman Church, whether as canon law expert at the Council of Basel and after as legate on Constantinople, and later to German dioceses and houses of religion, as bishop in his own diocese of Brixen, and as advisor in the papal curia. His active life as a church administrator and bishop found written expression in several hundred Latin sermons and more theoretical background in his writings on ecclesiology, ecumenism, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. Cusanus had an open and curious mind. He was learned and steeped in the Neoplatonic tradition, well aware of both humanist and scholastic learning, yet mostly self-taught in philosophy and theology. Nicholas anticipated many later ideas in mathematics, cosmology, astrology, and experimental science, while constructing his own original version of systematic Neoplatonism. A whole range of earlier medieval writers, such as Thierry of Chartres, Ramon Lull, and Albert the Great, influenced Nicholas, but his important intellectual roots are in Proclus and Dionysius the Areopagite. In spite of his significance, few later thinkers apart from Giordano Bruno understood or were influenced by him until the late 19th century. So that's Nicholas of Cusa. Jakob Böhme. was a German philosopher, Christian mystic, and Lutheran Protestant theologian. He was considered an original thinker by many of Böhme's contemporaries within the Lutheran tradition, and Böhme's first book, commonly known as Aurora, caused a great scandal. In contemporary English, Böhme's name may be spelled Jakob Böhme, retaining the older German spelling. In 17th century England, it was also spelled Bayman, approximating the contemporary English pronunciation of the German Böhme. Böhme had a profound influence on later philosophical movements such as German idealism and German romanticism. Hegel described Böhme as quote, the first German philosopher, end quote. Anyone else need to look up? Alright. I know enough about Plato and Leibniz where I don't feel the need to look them up. They're not totally new to me, even though I'm not an expert in them. Bloch objects against Hegel that he adheres too rigidly to the principle of the three stages in development, even when, quote, four or more elements ... are actively involved, end quote. An old crux in the interpretation of Hegel is the transition from ontological logic to the philosophy of nature. Hegel is unable to show clearly how and why the stationary and perfect, quote, idea, end quote, is releasing itself into nature, and Schilling's criticism already recognized here the weak point in Hegelian panlogic. However, while a kind of speculative concept of creation appears in the perfect Hegelian system, the young Hegel, according to Bloch, tends towards materialism. In the Jena Logic, Hegel wrote, quote, the absolute reason and essence of all things is the ether or absolute matter, absolute elasticity, ... end quote. With considerable scholarly zeal, Bloch searches for such, quote, crypto-materialistic statements, end quote, by Hegel to set against his spiritualistic and pantheistic system. He often appears to set greater store by precisely those aspects of Hegel which Lukacs would define as, quote, irrational and, quote, reactionary. For example, the qualification of nature as a Bachantic God, end quote, is praised in Hegel's relationship with Jakob Böhme emphasized. Bloch also shows a sensitive understanding of Hegelian natural philosophy and praises its dialectic qualitative thought by comparison with the quantitative mechanistic thought of natural science. The, quote, truth of nature is the dialectical history of its development in relation to man, end quote. Bloch also remained faithful to this evaluation of a speculative consideration of nature and developed it further in his lecture on the differentiation of the notion of progress. The resulting demand for a second cosmology in natural history, which could be interpreted as being from the outset concerned with the realization of the human world, led to violent criticism. Footnote. There's no footnote, actually. It's just a citation in German that I don't understand. But Bloch is simply being logical. If dialectics is to cover reality and reality's entirety, and if human history is to be recognized as meaningful, this rational process must also be projected back into nature, so that it can be derived materialistically from nature. The meaning of the, quote, progressive, end quote, character of development can never be arrived at from nature empty of meaning, which is the object of natural scientific research. Bloch is the only Marxist who has clearly stated this fact and drawn the consequences from it, namely the consequence of a natural philosophy and a dialectical interpretation of the meaning of nature side by side with natural science, which does not consider meanings. However, the Soviet ideologists are concerned above all with utilizing the esteem which the natural sciences enjoy for their own ideology. They must therefore energetically reject Bloch's, quote, second, end quote, cosmology. The unique and meaningful process of human development on Earth then inevitably seems embedded in the meaningless circuit of cosmic events of which Friedrich Engels already spoke, without any form of horror, and the meaning of earthly and human events would finally be lost. Come on. As Ernst Bloch who in the last resort thought in religious terms, emphasized, the world of man, man's culture, is only a provisional game which is condemned to return to the dead matter from which it arose, perhaps to arise again eons later in some other part of the universe. Footnote. Engels in the Dialectics of Nature, quote, nothing is eternal other than the eternally changing and moving matter and the laws according to which matter moves and changes, ... We have the certainty that matter remains eternally the same in all of matter's metamorphoses. Matter remains eternally the same in all of matter's metamorphoses, that none of matter's attributes can ever be lost, and that with the same iron necessity through which it will one day eliminate its highest expression on earth, once again, namely thinking man, it will produce the same man one day elsewhere in another age. End quote. Engels, Dialectic of Nature. A few pages earlier, Engels intentionally takes up the ancient theories of cyclic progression, in particular those of Heraclitus. This cyclical theory admittedly supersedes the belief in infinite progress, to which Engels pays tribute in his Anti-During. There he states, quote, the sovereign power of thought is embodied in a series of men who think in the most unsovereign terms. The knowledge which has absolute claim to truth in a series of relative errors. Neither the one nor the other can be fully achieved except through an infinite duration of mankind. End quote. Anti-During. Engels and Anti-During. Since the life of man is finite and the future humanity will have to begin from first principles like our earliest ancestors, human cognition remains constantly on the move, and Engels should have agreed with the dominant positivism of his age in an awareness of this limit of cognition. End footnote. The world of man, his culture, is only a provisional game which is condemned to return to the dead matter from which it arose, perhaps to arise again eons later in some other part of the universe. The thoughts which Bloch developed on Hegel's philosophy of history are predominantly critical. Fault is already found in their general position, quote, as a mere final element after the internal and external law of the state has already developed, end quote. This arrangement could, of course, also be interpreted in Hegel's favor. What appears to him highly realistic is not, at that time, the utopian call for a League of Nations or a world republic, but the real force over this sovereign state, history, which dominates everything. History then has the task of completing what still remains unfinished in the existing state of the world. Admittedly, the history which Hegel presents is not history going beyond the existing state, but rather past history. However, by placing history as such at the end of this part of the system, he recognized in it to some extent that, quote, openness to the future, end quote, which Bloch finds so sadly lacking in him. Eric Weil has emphasized this openness and cites the following passage from Hegel's Encyclopedia, quote, the state finally has the aspect of being the direct reality of a single and naturally determination. As a single entity, it excludes all others. In dealings between such entities, chance and arbitrary action come into play, because the common law which should exist between them does not in fact exist, end quote. Eric Weil. That's actually from Hegel's Encyclopedia. Sorry, that's Hegel. That quote was Hegel from a book, as found in a book by Eric Weil. Wikipedia says Eric Weil lived from 1904 to 1977 and was a French-German philosopher noted for the development of a theory that places the effort to understand violence at the center of philosophy. Calling himself a post-Hegelian Kantian, Weil was a key figure in the 20th century reception of Hegel in France, as well as the renewed interest in Kant in that country. The author of major original works, critical studies, and numerous essays in French, his adopted language as well as German and English, Weil was both an active academic as well as public intellectual, involved in various fecund moments of French intellectual life. Weil was, for example, a participant in the famous lectures given by Alexandre Kojève on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, and would go on to play an instrumental role at the journal Critique during its start, and then serve as one of its editors for a number of years. An influential teacher, Erich Weil's students, such as Bourdieu, have noted Weil's formative role in their intellectual development. This influence was also at the origin of the creation of the Institut Erich Weil, a foundation and research library created by a group of his former students after his death. A systematic thinker, Weil's works follow Kant's divide between practical and theoretical philosophy. A complete statement of his thought is developed in his Logique de la philosophie of 1950 and Philosophie politique 1956 and Philosophie morale 1961. These books show how the effort to understand violence by subsuming violence under a discursive form is the basis of philosophical reflection. Because there are always novel forms of violence that grow out of older, already understood and subsumed forms of violence, Weil insists on the role of history in philosophical discourse. The role of history is seen in Weil's political thought, for instance, where Weil rejects the contractualist notion of an original position and instead underlines the historic, context-specific, and often violent origin of political formations, usually by territory-grabbing military leaders. This historical origin is used to explain how cultural and political traditions are often inhabited by antique forms of violence that can resurge at any moment or can have perverting effects on the formation of political identity. Back to the text. The words emphasized by Weil, direct, single, natural, chance, arbitrary, should, all have a negative significance for Hegel. They mark an imperfection, a quote, not yet, end quote, in the process of dialectical development, from which it follows that if for Hegel the quote, state as such, end quote, is perfect, this does not hold true of the individual states existing in his own age. In the dialectical scheme of things, the presentation of the, quote, perfectly reasonable state, end quote, is therefore followed by history, which has the task of creating the uniform and universal kingdom of complete freedom from the contrast between the individual imperfect states, which can only approximate to this ideal. True, this view of the future is not explicit in Hegel, quote, the fifth kingdom which awaits Daniel and the heretics in the future, ... is not even mentioned as a form of fanaticism as in Kant, end quote, but it remains a fact that after the development of the state in the philosophy of right and the encyclopedia, history achieves history's rights and, as Bloch himself remarks, adopts the position which, quote, in reality should be the preserve of international law or a League of Nations, end quote. In Hegel's, quote, realistic philosophy, end quote, the, quote, ought, end quote, as such has no place, but the ought's place is marked. The philosophy of right of 1821 and the philosophy of right's much-quoted preface also cannot simply be dismissed as, quote, reactionary, end quote, according to Bloch. When Hegel maintains in his preface that philosophy always makes its appearance post festum, that the quote, owl of Minerva begins the owl of Minerva's flight only at dusk, end quote, according to Bloch, this is already contradicted by the origin of Hegel's own philosophy. The content of the philosophy of right is also not merely an apology for the conditions in Prussia during Hegel's age. It is true that this philosophy lays no claim to being anything other than, quote, its age expressed in thought, end quote. But this philosophy is not satisfied with merely reproducing something which in fact exists. Instead, it postulates as, quote, real, end quote, a whole range of conditions which did not yet exist in Prussia at the time. Erich Weil has also quoted these, quote, anomalies, end quote, and cited them in defense of Hegel. The state which is, quote, idealized, end quote, by Hegel is characterized by public trials, freedom of the press, emancipation of the Jews, equality before the law, a share enjoyed by the people in lawmaking, and so on, all provisions which were not found in the Kingdom of Prussia in 1821. However, Bloch also does not forget to mention the famous sections 244, 245, and 246, in which Hegel presents a sober analysis of the problems and antagonisms in an early industrial society. Polemics in Bloch's study of Hegel center more on the system and on turning dialectics to practical use than on emphasis of the, quote, scientific superiority, end quote, of materialism over idealism, which is normally the case with Soviet ideologists. Bloch's critique of Hegel does not center on the materialistic transformation, but on the relationship with the future in social practice. Marx's, quote, revolutionary practice, end quote, not the banal everyday practice of Engels. In place of the, quote, closed system, end quote, from Aristotle to Hegel, and we might add to Stalin, he presents the, quote, marching orders, exclamation point, of the bracket, exclamation point, end bracket, of the open system, which are as flexible as they are comprehensive, end quote. And praises such openness in Kant, whose depth Hegel is said to have overlooked, this indirectly stating that Lenin and Engels completely misunderstood Kant, quote, in the sense of the still incomplete process of revelation of depth, end quote. But if history is still essentially incomplete, and if history's final form is not yet visible, we must know in advance what is the objective of future history, if we are to interpret the permanent meaning in historical development. Such knowledge can, however, only be prophecy, and in the case of Bloch, it is inadequately hidden behind formulas such as that of the, quote, mindfulness of a world which succeeds in human terms and of its entelechy, end quote. Bloch would certainly accept the reproach of, quote, prophecy, end quote, and, quote, utopianism, end quote, because Bloch tries to incorporate the continual reality of the, quote, principle of hope, end quote, in man, and in particular the broad masses of the people, the, quote, plebeian tradition, end quote, as a historical reality in the material pattern of history, and anticipates and welcomes the long sought-after realization of all prophecies and utopias of mankind in the proletarian revolution and socialist society. Here, too, the enthusiastic apologist of the revolution becomes an opponent of the Soviet ideologists, because the enthusiastic apologist of the revolution abandons the, quote, scientific character, end quote, of dialectical materialism and reveals the fundamental difference between the factual knowledge of natural science and technology and prophetic knowledge of the future realization of the complete humanization of man. While pure science is in fact, quote, free from values, end quote, an interpretation of the meaning of the human world is always related to values. Original Marxist thought included a normative concept of man which was perfectly compatible with historical thought viewed as a science in Hegel's sense. But when Marxism developed more and more into a scientific philosophy in the sense of the positive sciences of nature and society, this normative element had to be eliminated. It appeared on the one hand as a specific, quote, socialist ethic, end quote, in Forländer, Cohen, and Natorp, and others, and was rejected on the other by the, quote, orthodox, end quote, communists, true to the letter of the doctrine, so that the human context was altogether lost and the in reality indispensable norm had to be taken from a non-human area, for example, the, quote, requirements of the development of material production, end quote, in the case of Stalin. However, all consideration of the original Marx and his teacher Hegel necessarily leads to a demonstration of the human content of the doctrine, and must therefore be combated by the proponents of a form of socialism which has become inhuman. It is not the, quote, idealistic, end quote, attitude which is actually feared, but the possibility of taking seriously Marx's intention to humanize man in his world. It is not the approximation to Hegel, but the demonstration of the real difference between Hegel and Marx that is essentially rejected. The recollection of Marx's statement that philosophy cannot be abolished without implementing philosophy first, that is, without turning philosophy's spiritual ideal into a flesh and blood reality, sounds like a constant approach against the Soviet system of party domination. Section D. Stalinist critics of Lukacs and Bloch. The article entitled, quote, The Marxist Dialectical Method Contrasted with the Idealistic Dialectics of Hegel, end quote, by Arno Gropp, summarizes all the arguments which orthodox Stalinist dialectical materialism defends itself against a Hegelian and genuinely dialectical interpretation of Marxism. it's a Wikipedia, German Wikipedia, says Rugard Otto Grope, also known as Otto Wilhelm Grope, who lived from 1907 to 1976, was a German Marxist-Leninist philosopher. His life thing is pretty short, so I'll read that. Between 1926 and 1929, Grope studied history, philosophy, art history, and newspaper studies in the university cities of Leipzig, Munich, and Berlin. As a member of the Communist Party of Germany, Grope was arrested in the Third Reich and imprisoned in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, among other places. After the Second World War in 1945, Grope continued his studies at the Martin Luther University at Halle-Wittenberg. In 1948, Grope received his doctorate from the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Leipzig on the subject of, quote, on the problems of bourgeois history and society, an investigation from the standpoint of historical materialism, end quote, and in the same year attended the, quote, Karl Marx, end quote, party school in Kleinmachnow. Grope had been a member of the party since 1946, before he belonged to the KPD in Halle until the forced merger of the SPD and KPD. Grope taught at the University of Halle until 1950, then moved to the University of Leipzig, where he completed his habilitation in 1953 with the thesis, quote, Prerequisites and Structure of Historical Science, a Critique of Historical Empiricism, end quote, and was subsequently appointed Professor of Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Grope was a critic of Ernst Bloch and his work, The Principle of Hope. At a philosophy conference in 1954, Grope publicly criticized Bloch's work. A year later, however, Grope served as editor of the, quote, Fettschrift Ernst Bloch zum 70 Geburtstag. Grope was Bloch's colleague in the field of social sciences at the University of Leipzig. On December 19, 1956, a long article by Grope appeared in the SED Central Organ, Neues Deutschland, in which he accused Bloch of idealism. According to Arno Münster, Grope wrote the article on instructions from higher up and was intended to prepare an accusation against Bloch for revisionism. R.O. Grope wrote 2 more articles against Bloch in 1957. R.O. Grope had already taken part in a campaign against the Marxist professor Leo Koffler in Halle at the end of the 1940s, and had subjected Koffler to severe criticism. The reason for this was his work, The Science of Society. As a result, Leo Koffler finally went to the Federal Republic of Germany in 1950. In 1957, R.O. Grope received the Patriotic Order of Merit in Bronze. Oh, maybe it's in bronze. I don't fucking know. On the occasion of the I'm not sure. There's a typo here. It says, on the occasion of the 550th anniversary of the Karl Marx University of Leipzig, the Patriotic Order of Merit in silver. I don't know. There's a typo there, though. I can't really think of how to correct it. So, back to the text. The evidence, which sometimes takes the form of an accusation, is based primarily on Soviet sources and takes as its point of departure the dialectical materialism adopted by Stalin as the highest form of, quote, science, end quote, and philosophy. By taking Stalinist dialectical materialism as his main standard, R.O. Grope replaces, without being aware of the extent of this operation, the proletarian revolution and the humanized free classless society of future communism, which Marx and Engels had assumed to be the aim of history, by the completion of the pure doctrine. Quote, in considering the history of philosophy, we must work from the history of philosophy's results, dialectical materialism. The history of philosophy is made understandable only by examining the history of philosophy's results, end quote. For Marx, on the other hand, the, quote, result, end quote, of the history of philosophy is the, quote, revolutionary practice, end quote, of the proletarian revolution. Marx was not concerned with a, quote, new higher philosophy, end quote, but with a new and more human reality. Accordingly, there develops an immediate gap between the genuine dialectical and concrete consideration of history by Marx, as in Lukacs, Korsch, Horkheimer, Marcuse, and so on, and the ideological Stalinist standpoint. However, if a complete, quote, scientific philosophy, end quote, is the essential aim of historical development, the previous systems of thought are necessarily evaluated other than they would have been if revolutionary practice and the humanization expected of it were assumed as the objective. Group's polemic does not set out to defend the proletarian revolution and the communist society of the future as the aim of the, quote, realization of philosophy, end quote, but instead to preserve the purity of the doctrine against, quote, idealistic falsification, end quote. What is involved is purely controversy over, quote, theology, end quote, and not a theory related to revolutionary practice. The, quote, unity of theory and practice, end quote, which is one of the basic dogmas of dialectical materialism, is mentioned only marginally and in the simplified form introduced by Engels. Kantianism and Hegelianism are considered as two equally dangerous deviations from the general line, and attention is drawn to the fact that since 1917, the creeping and therefore doubly dangerous influence of Hegel has repeatedly made itself felt within the Communist Party. In this context, reference is made to the works by Korsch and Lukacs in Germany and to the, quote, Menshevist, end quote, idealism of de Bourrine in the Soviet Union. The struggle against, quote, reconciliation with Hegelian idealism, end quote, is said to be particularly necessary at present. I just wanted to read real quick some of the things on de Bourrine. Basically, he was an intellectual in the Soviet Union, but I want to read some of the more detailed things about him. It says, soon after the October Revolution of 1917, de Bourrine, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, left the Mensheviks and began lecturing at the Sverdlov Communist University, the Institute of Red Professors, and the Institute of Philosophy. De Bourrine soon assumed editorial duties at the journal under the banner of Marxism, which de Bourrine headed from 1926 to 1931. De Bourrine joined the Communist Party in 1928. Following the 1917 October Revolution, Soviet philosophy found Soviet philosophy itself divided between two factions. The, quote, dialecticians, end quote, headed up by de Bourrine, end quote, mechanists, end quote, whose leading figure was the philosopher Lyubov Axelrod. The then prominent Bolshevik leader Nikolai Bukharin was seen as an ally of the, quote, mechanists, end quote, although Bukharin did not entirely agree with them. The next section says, under Stalin, Abram de Bourrine was castigated for, quote, Menshevizing idealism, end quote. In 1931, Joseph Stalin decided the issue of the debate between dialecticians and mechanists by publishing a decree which identified dialectical materialism as pertaining solely to Marxism-Leninism. Stalin then codified it in Dialectical and Historical Materialism of 1938 by enumerating the, quote, laws of dialectics, end quote, which are the grounds of particular disciplines, and in particular the science of history, which guarantees their conformity to the, quote, proletarian conception of the world, end quote. Thus, Diamant was imposed on most communist parties affiliated to the Third International. Diamant became the official philosophy of the Soviet Union and remained as such until its dissolution. When Stalin decided in favor of dialectical materialism, de Bourrine made a show of support for Stalin's position. Some years afterwards, de Bourrine kept a low profile, and most of his writings were suppressed. However, de Bourrine lived long enough to see all of his works republished in the Soviet Union during the, quote, thaw, end quote, under Nikita Khrushchev. Back to the text. The struggle against, quote, reconciliation with Hegelian idealism, end quote, is said to be particularly necessary at present. In the name of this struggle, the work of Lukacs and Bloch, as well as Cornu and Behrens, who follows on from Cornu and Lukacs, must be rejected. There's a footnote here that I missed. The historical philosophy expressed in Group's theory is strictly speaking identical with that of Hegel. except that the speculative idealism of the great thinker is replaced by the supposed materialism of Stalin the politician. The entire past history of philosophy therefore assumes meaning from this end. End footnote. The person being referred to is Auguste Cornu, who was a French Marxist philosopher and historian of Marxism who lived from 1888 to 1981. Auguste Cornu was born on the 9th of August 1888 in Benue, France. He joined the French section of the Workers' International in 1913 and later joined the French Communist Party in 1944. Cornu's 1934 doctoral thesis was the academic thesis on Karl Marx, a member of the French resistance. Auguste Cornu moved to East Berlin after World War II. From 1949 to 1956, Cornu was professor at the Humboldt University of Berlin. Sorry. Okay. Back to the text. In Otto Grope's evaluation of the political attitude of Hegel, Otto Grope is in complete agreement with Stalin and the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. He often quotes the latter as, quote, evidence, end quote. While Hegel's philosophy is evaluated as an expression of the feudal aristocratic German reaction to the French Revolution, the materialism of the 18th century appears as the essentially higher and more valuable philosophy, which could be taken up again directly by Marx and Engels. Quote, in spite of its dialectics, Hegelian philosophy is more metaphysical, foreign to reality, abstract, and non-concrete than the French materialism of the 18th century, end quote. Quote, Lukacs is wrong in defining Hegelian philosophy as the highest form of bourgeois philosophy, when in reality German idealism around 1800 was a reaction against French materialism of the 18th century as an ideology of the anti-feudal combative bourgeoisie, end quote. There's a footnote here that I missed. Auguste Cornu's early work on Karl Marx and the development of modern thought has been superseded by his more cautious and orthodox large biography, Karl Marx et Friedrich Engels, 3 volumes published in Paris between 1955 and 1962. This work, too, has been sharply criticized by some representatives of the Eastern Bloc press. The Polish philosopher Fritz Hand, however, mentions it in his article quoted below as a shining exception from the usual underestimation of the young Marx. End footnote. These observations by Grope admittedly contradict the historical truth in many statements by Marx and Engels, but are only logical from the standpoint of an ideology no longer concerned with revolutionary practice and the intelligibility of historical substance, but instead with establishing an all-embracing philosophical system which serves to justify a hierarchical order of dominance. Like Stalin and above all Zhdanov, Otto Grope has also emphasized the chasm between Marx and Hegel. Grope's entire essay aims to open an unbridgeable gulf between Hegel and Marx, precisely to the extent that dialectical materialism approaches in fact to Hegelian philosophy as a comprehensive philosophical system. He finds it necessary to increase the distance between Marx and Hegel, in place of the contrast between a contemplative philosophy and a purely spiritual abolition of the contradictions in the Hegelian system and practical theory, as well as the concrete social abolition of the contradictions as presented by Marx. There is a contrast between two forms of philosophy. The unity of theory and practice is replaced by the unity of theory, philosophy, and method, which Grope moves to the center of his presentation. Marxian dialectics no longer appear as a concretization and practical development of Hegelian dialectics, but instead a completely new method. Grope is aware that through this theory, Grope conflicts with the generally known and recognized historical truth, but he is all the more vigorous in his condemnation of the, quote, prejudice, end quote, on which this historical truth is supposedly based. Quote, there is a widespread philosophical prejudice in Germany which consists in presenting Marxism as a development of Hegelianism and defining Hegelian dialectics as the real starting point for Marxism. The opinion is held that Marx and Engels simply rejected Hegelian idealism and Hegel's system, but took over his dialectics. Based on a mistaken and simplified interpretation of certain statements by Marx and Engels, the materialist dialectics is presented as a simple reversal of the Hegelian. The unilateral elucidation of the history of the origin of Marxism is used more or less to justify idealism. Dialectics becomes a philosophical link, bracket, which must not exist, Iring Fetscher, end bracket, between Hegel and Marx, between idealism and materialism, ... Marxist dialectics is a new development by comparison with Hegelian dialectics. It has its basis in materialism, end quote. Otto Grope. Marxist dialectics is said to have arisen through a scientific confrontation of the, quote, material, end quote, whereas Hegelian dialectics is due to a systematic and schematizing perversion of the facts. Grope fails to understand that Hegelian dialectics did not drop from heaven either, but arose from a concern with the problem of, quote, positivity, end quote, and the question of humanity in the midst of a world of increasing alienation. Grope believes that not only the Hegelian solution, but the questions asked by Hegel, which are identical with the humanistic problems of Schiller, Hölderlin, and others, are, quote, reactionary, end quote, and he contrasts Hegel with the materialism of the 17th and 18th centuries, which is often extremely hostile to man. Materialism is not seen in the first instance as the requirement for Marx's concretization of Hegelian anthropology. His concept of man is an objective, sensual, and active being, but is a general philosophy which stands in permanent, rigid contradiction of the false, unscientific, idealistic philosophy. Grope, like Stalin, works here with mythically fixed categories which are turned into mysterious subjects of philosophical history and face each other with the hostility of old Persian dogma. The fuck's that mean? Is that something I should know in the history of ideas? I'm not seeing anything. All, quote, progress, end quote, is therefore associated with materialism, which only reaction and inhumanity are associated with idealism, a contrast which even a rapid survey of the history of political philosophy will prove completely incorrect. Grope attempts to reconstruct the origins of Marxism with the least possible mention of the Hegelian influence. It is understood schematically as a, quote, extension, end quote, of French materialism to history and society, an extension which made it necessary to use dialectical categories. Quote, the further development of materialism by its application to society and further through the progress of natural sciences led to materialist dialectics. Materialist dialectics is grounded in materialist theory, end quote. The decisive, quote, contrast, end quote, with Hegelian dialectics is not therefore seen, as one might assume, in the practical realization of dialectics through a turning away from mere contemplation to action, but in the starting form of the, quote, materialist Weltanschauung, end quote, which is simply extended into a further area hitherto not or only inadequately considered by materialism. Just as Otto Grope increases the distance between Marx and Hegel, so Otto Grope reduces the difference between the, quote, metaphysical materialism, end quote, of the 18th century and dialectical materialism, and changes it into a purely quantitative difference. Oro Grupp admits that Marx at first developed only historical materialism in concrete terms, but he held that dialectical materialism was already the systematic basis, while the Marxist philosophy of history applied this general theory only to its special field. Grupp admits that the general dialectical materialist theory and the general dialectical materialist theory's application to nature can be found primarily in Engels, but Grupp rejects the limitation of Marxist theory to the socio-historical sector as a dangerous left-wing deviation. The final secret motive of Oro Grupp's arguments, lies in the fact that Stalin called for an all-embracing dialectical materialist Weltanschauung, and that Marx therefore must have wanted precisely an all-embracing dialectical materialist Weltanschauung, even if Marx did not himself have, quote, enough time, end quote, to develop all aspects of the dialectical materialist Weltanschauung. The unconscious idealism of this teleological history of philosophy cannot escape notice. Grupp makes the detailed criticism that Lukacs developed a picture of Hegel which is of a nature to reduce Marx's own merits. The origin of this reproach is surely to be found in the area of the personality cult, but it must be remembered that the history of philosophy, like general history, is concerned not with the fame and honor of individuals, but with truth and the recognition of truth. Grupp sees the reduction of Marx's merits and of the originality of historical materialism, for example, in the fact that Lukacs draws attention to the importance of a study of classical political economy by Hegel, so that Marx is no longer the first to combine dialectical thought and economics, a biographical trait which was as good as overlooked before Lukacs and therefore no doubt seems a dangerous innovation to Oro Grupp. The reference to Hegel's positive evaluation of the French Revolution also conflicts with Grupp's Stalinist orthodoxy and is therefore rejected as false without any material discussion. In no case, however, does Oro Grupp attempt to show the falsity of Lukacs' theories in a concrete manner by reference to Hegel's own text. If Lukacs finally interprets Hegel's idealism as a consequence of the conditions in the Germany he knew, this again seems to Grupp to be an impermissible apology for Hegel, whom he obviously wishes to condemn outright on Stalinist lines, but does not seek to interpret historically. His opposition to Lukacs is based in the last resort on the fact that Lukacs still tries to understand Hegel and interpret Hegel's philosophy in terms of its association with the time and society in which it arose, exactly as Marx himself does, whereas Grupp is concerned only with the polemic rejection of an imaginary attack by bourgeois Hegelians on the pure doctrine of dialectical materialism. If Lukacs finally praises Hegel's realism and associates Hegel with the abandon of a real utopian solution to the contradictions in capitalist society, Grupp becomes extremely disturbed because Grupp simply cannot understand how, under certain specific conditions, an extreme objective idealism could be the prerequisite for realistic knowledge. The departure from original Marxism is particularly clear when Grupp accuses Hegel of abandoning ethical standards and moralizing criticism. In the last resort, however, Marx defined his foundation of socialism as, quote, scientific, end quote, precisely because, unlike the utopian systems, it abandons any value judgment applied externally to historical reality. It is a well-known fact that Marx did not condemn capitalism in moral terms and also did not explain the bourgeois ideology as the result of a moral inferiority in the bourgeois character, but shows the historical necessity and transient nature of both. When, therefore, Lukacs explains Hegel's idealism from the social conditions in which he lived, and when he praises Hegel's historical thought, which is very close to Marxism on this point, he does nothing which Marx had not done before him. The Stalinist Grupp, there, however, has in the meantime simplified reality to such an extent that Oro Grupp is now able to see the history of philosophy only in moralizing cliches. All materialists are advocates of progress and good, while all idealists are obscure reactionaries and therefore bad. Footnote. In Zu Fragen der Geschichte der Philosophie und des dialektischen Materialismus, I think that's the question of the history of philosophy and of dialectical materialism. I think that's what that translates as. Grupp makes a more cautious statement, quote, idealism is generally represented by the reactionary classes who defend class rule against advanced or revolutionary movements, On the other hand, materialism is generally the philosophy of classes or class fractions who are interested in the development of the productive forces and direct their attention against forms of rule which inhibit development, ... end quote. Oro Grope. Oro Grope also adds the specific warning, quote, materialism must therefore not merely be understood as the philosophy of the exploited classes, unlike idealism as a philosophy of the exploiters. Such a simplification does not correspond to reality, ... end quote. In other words, materialists always stand for social progress, but not always for the exploited classes, because the exploited classes do not necessarily directly represent progress. Through this distinction, Grope attempts to adapt his two-part philosophy more fittingly to historical reality. End footnote. Anyone who praises an idealist as a, quote, realistic, end quote, thinker is therefore himself a suspect fellow traveler of the bourgeoisie in the proletarian camp. The ultimate reason for the differing evaluation of Hegel reached by Lukács and the Stalinist group is to be found in their differing appraisal of the significance of the epochs in modern history. For Lukács, the decisive break in modern development lies in the rise of capitalism, which turns all human relations into socially mediated forms and therefore makes the world one which is entirely created by man, if unconsciously for the time being. He accordingly examines why an adequate awareness of this totality could only be reached if in the proletariat, and interprets the great classical philosophers from Kant to Hegel as the English classical political economic theories as so many attempts necessarily doomed to failure to achieve a satisfactory consciousness and self-awareness of the totality of society. He shows how the highest point which classical bourgeois thought was able to reach was an awareness of the antinomies in society, antinomies whose clear expression was found by Hegel because Hegel abandoned all search for utopian solutions and even the call for all solutions, and destroyed speculatively the real contrast in an ideal, quote, beyond, end quote. For Oro Grope and Soviet ideology, the decisive and incomparably more important historical break is the October Revolution of 1917. In attempting to put this event into the correct light, an anxious effort is made to avoid everything which might give rise to an idea of continuity between Marxism and German idealism. For the young, hopeful revolutionary Lukács of 1923 and the protesting Poles of 1956, this need of emphasizing a contrast and of stressing the different nature of the theory itself did not exist. They were concerned with achieving a social order which differed in practical terms from the capitalist society of exploitation and the, quote, transcended, end quote, humanistic aspirations of the philosophies. The Soviet ideologists, on the other hand, have to justify a society which aims to catch up under an apparently Marxist flag with the industrial development achieved in Western countries by capitalist means. The similarity of the bad practice led to an all the more violent emphasis of the differences in the theory. Friedrich Behrens, who developed Lukács' analysis still further in his article Hegel's Economic Theories and Beliefs, is reproached, like Lukács himself, by R.L. Grope with, quote, interpreting too much Marxism into Hegel's philosophy, end quote, and therefore disregarding the chasm which is supposed to separate Marx and Hegel. Unfortunately, Grope forgets to consider the arguments and quotations which are present in profusion in both authors, and which Marx and Hegel back up their theories. Friedrich Behrens based his conclusions primarily on the Jena Realphilosophie, which contains material published only long after Hegel's lifetime and with which Marx could not have been acquainted. The relationship between Marx and Hegel which Lukács and Behrens observe, therefore, does nothing to lessen Marx's originality. It simply shows that by going back to the core of Hegelian thought and reinterpreting the core of Hegelian thought, Marx, with the insight of genius, brought to light of day some elements which were at the origin of this thought, but which were hidden under a rigid system. If Marx reinterpreted and criticized the mature Hegel in such a way that ideas appear in Marx which have near counterparts in the then unknown youthful works of Hegel, that is not an argument against Marx, but rather evidence in favor of his brilliant interpretation. While in Grope's opinion, Behrens and Lukács discovered excessively close links between Hegel and Marx, he sees Bloch's fault in the fact that he consciously tried to incorporate Hegelianism into dialectical materialism. It is said that Bloch exaggerates Hegel's significance almost to a, quote, supra-historical level. a quote super historical end quote level, which should not be criticism in the eyes of the representative of an quote eternal truth end quote, which is what Grope sets out to be. It is also claimed to be impermissible to see a criterion for Marxist orthodoxy in the positive relationship with Hegel. Bloch, it is said, failed to notice the contrast between Hegelian and Marxist dialectics, which are repeatedly emphasized by Grope. In highlighting this contrast, Hegel is misunderstood and simplified by Grope after the manner of the late right-wing Hegelians. Hegel did not, as although Grope asserts, primarily deduce reality from a supreme ideal principle and graft onto it the system of triads, which is never handled so rigidly from outside. Admittedly, there are many examples of such a method in Hegel, but these conflict with the express intention of Hegelian philosophy. Hegel, too, wanted to develop the dialectical movement as the movement of objects. Hegel's theory of knowledge also made it necessary to accept the inherent movement and structure of reality. Footnote. As far as I can see, Max Adler was the first Marxist to take a stand against this interpretation of Hegel and draw attention to Hegel's great realism. Quote, the bold step taken by Hegel himself was to show the reality of the idea, not in the bowdlerized manner in which the vulgar opinion of our own age is reflected, i.e. that reality has, quote, vaporized, end quote, into ideas, but in that fresh and mature attitude according to which direct reality, with direct reality's entire fullness of values and powerful presence, could be detected as the living reflection of the idea which itself develops. Reality was no longer a dull and passive object, a kind of dregs of thought, but the continuous effectiveness of the spirit, indeed the spirit of the world in its regular action, end quote. In the next section, Adler defines Hegel as the, quote, teacher, end quote, who led Marx to, quote, conceive of reality as a process with its own laws, in which everything developed and moved forward only according to its inner force, end quote. Adler here clearly recognizes the distinction between Hegelian realism and the appearance of a subjective idealism in the young Hegelians, who contrasts a reasonable ideal with the unreasonable present, and states that Marx reflects the superior standpoint of Hegel against the young Hegelians when he continues with his rational development of Hegel's thought and therefore goes beyond Hegel himself. End footnote. The criticism put forward by the young Marx against Hegel's philosophy of right, the state law, is therefore an imminent form of criticism which measures Hegel's theory by its own yardsticks and shows how it lags behind the requirements of such objectivity. R.O. Grope reveals himself in his true colors, however, when R.O. Grope deals with the relationship between theory and practice. I've already mentioned the fact, for example, in the section on Georg Lukacs' History and Class Consciousness, that the notion of, quote, revolutionary practice, end quote, was given a significance by Engels and his followers other than it originally had in the writings of Marx himself. It becomes increasingly identified with experimental and industrial, quote, practice, end quote, which is certainly not the true revolutionary historical practice, but leaves the historico-social whole essentially unchanged and involves no conscious collective, quote, subject, end quote. If Marx's theory is considered analogous to the structures of modern science, practice no longer appears to form a dialectical unity with it. There can be no becoming practice of the theory, no transcendence into practice, and the relationship between theory and practice is understood after the model of the relationship between natural science and technology. Marx's theory is here consciously identified with the natural science as a form of, quote, Herrschaftswissen, knowledge in the service of domination, the same form of consciousness whose predominance Lukács hoped would be eliminated by the proletarian revolution because it must lead to objectification and alienation in its application to human reality. According to Grope, quote, the relationship between theory and practice is already stated in an abstract manner in pre-Marxian materialism. The materialist Hobbes, to give one example, shows in the following sentences that all theory tends towards practical implementation. Quote, the end or scope of philosophy is that we may make use to our benefit of effects formerly seen, or that, by application of bodies to one another, we may produce the like effects of those we conceive in our minds, as far forth as matter, strength, and industry will permit. For the community of human life, the end of knowledge is power, end quote. Hobbes, concerning body. Hobbes also speaks of the need for a scientific social theory, which Hobbes considers unhistorically as a scientific, quote, moral philosophy, end quote. However, it is only the recognition of the laws of development in society which makes the combination of theory with practice, bracket, sue me. Oh, so, fuck, god damn it. I'm fucking this whole thing up. Alright, this is a quote from Grob. The relationship between theory and practice is already understood in an abstract manner in pre-Marxian materialism. The materialist Hobbes, to give one example, shows in the following sentence that all theory tends towards practical implementation. Quote, the end or scope of philosophy is that we may make use to our benefit of effects formerly seen, or that, by application of bodies to one another, we may produce the like effect of those we conceive in our mind, as far forth as matter, strength, and industry will permit. For the community of human life, the end of knowledge is power, end quote. Hobbes. Hobbes also speaks of the need for a scientific social theory, which Hobbes considers unhistorically as a scientific, quote, moral philosophy, end quote. However, it is only the recognition of the laws of development in society which makes the combination of theory with practice, bracket, in this area, question mark, Iring Fetscher, end bracket, possible, end quote. For Grote, therefore, there is no difference in principle between modern science as a means to acquire power propagated by Bacon and Hobbes, and, end quote, R.O. Grob. For R.O. Grob, therefore, there is no difference in principle between modern science as a means to acquire power propagated by Bacon and Hobbes and the, quote, science, end quote, of dialectical and historical materialism. In this way, Marxism is reduced to the level of Comte's positivism, with which it has other points in common in the Stalinist era. See, for example, the hierarchy of the sciences, which the Soviet philosopher Kedrov made the subject of special studies. It just says that Kedrov, Wikipedia just says that Kedrov was a philosopher in the Soviet Union. He was a specialist in the philosophy of dialectical materialism and the philosophy of science. Back to the text. If dialectical and historical materialism is a science in the sense that it can be applied by anybody for any purpose, as is the case with all other forms of scientific insight, the demonstration of a natural law is far from leading to the choice of an objective to be pursued by man. Human practice could not be simply determined by a theory understood in this way. At best, such theories could show that particular means have particular consequences. Finally, however, one is bound to ask for whose benefit the effects which have been anticipated are to be exploited, and who will handle and interpret the history. The answer can only be that this will be done by the absolutely sovereign supreme party leadership, which, on the basis of a belief without any rational justification, is thought to be acting in the interest of the, quote, workers, end quote. However, since the theory is asserted to be scientific, and since no one is allowed to propagate an interpretation of Marxism which deviates from the general line, the ideological as well as the political monopoly of the party leadership is maintained, and the suspicion arises that it is using quite different, such as mass psychological knowledge, rather than the dogma of dialectical materialism for its own advantage. The interpretation of Marxism as a form of knowledge in the service of domination or power by analogy with the natural sciences, which have technical applications, is explained by the fact that the leading interpreters of Marxism are, quote, engineers of power, end quote, who are closer to this form of thought than to the dialectical hermeneutic thought of Hegel and Marx. However, it is no chance that among the professors who advocate Marxism there are repeatedly, quote, heretics, end quote, who protest against this simplification of dialectical and historical materialism, but whose efforts are either not understood by those in power or else feared as endangering the maintenance of the, quote, established order, end quote, and therefore suppressed. In the materialist technicist thought of the Soviet ideologists, the human content of Marxist philosophy disappears. The revolution is no longer planned for the liberation of real man, but in the interest of the, quote, uninhibited development of productive forces, end quote, and the, quote, further development of the natural sciences, end quote. The, quote, anti-human materialism, end quote, of which the young Marx spoke, wins the day over humanistic forms of materialism. Otto Grope's work certainly makes no serious claim to being scientific. Otto Grope's polemic can be understood only as a mischievous contribution to the class struggle on the ideological front. The enemies of the Hegelian Marxists who would try to smuggle the Trojan horse of idealism into the beleaguered fortress of Soviet materialism under the cover of Hegelian dialectics. Otto Grope thinks in strategic categories. The sharpness of Otto Grope's polemic is based on the urgent risk which must be faced. Otto Grope claims that when in the 1920s Lenin recommended the study of Hegelian logic, Lenin wished to create a counterbalance to the trend of mechanism of Karn and his followers, but this has ceased to be necessary today, certainly in Germany. The main enemy within the party at present is Hegelianizing idealism. If Georg Lukacs is seen as the most dangerous opponent in this struggle, this is certainly because of the memory still living in many intellectual party circles of his book History and Class Consciousness. Thinkers of the rank of Georg Lukacs and Ernst Bloch cannot accept the idea of conforming so easily with the spiritless system of vulgar Soviet Marxism. In his work on problems of the history of philosophy and dialectical materialism, Otto Grope, that was published in 1958, Otto Grope toned down somewhat his rejection of Hegel and was able even to assert that, quote, the pre-Marxist thought on evolution culminated in Hegel's work with its generalized philosophical application, depth and penetration, end quote. Otto Grope. Elsewhere, however, on the problems of the history of philosophy and dialectical materialism, published in 1958, maintains the same positivist doctrine as the essay on Hegel, which we have already examined. This is expressed most clearly when Otto Grope deals with the relationship between philosophy and practice. Ernst Bloch, whom Otto Grope criticizes here, had written in his book on Hegel, quote, Hegel's philosophy could not result in the abolition of philosophy precisely because the abolition of philosophy would have been philosophy's dialectical realization. And because this realization in pure spiritualization would have no further object, not yet in the unalienated human being and certainly not in unalienated nature. And because Hegel's system is a closed system which objectifies that system's self, not an open system in the sense of a marching order, walking toward the non-spiritual objective which Marx refers to as, quote, the appropriation of objectified humanity by cancellation of objectified humanity's alienation, end quote. End quote. Ernst Bloch. On this subject, Otto Grope states, quote, with this sentence, Bloch attempts to base himself on a formulation of the young Marx. Bloch opines, unlike Hegel, and supposedly in the sense of Marx, that philosophy cannot be completed in itself, but in practice, quote, abolished, end quote, by its realization, end quote. Bloch. This is, in fact, something which Marx clearly stated in the introduction to a critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, quote, philosophy cannot be realized without the abolition of the proletariat, end quote. For Marx, this meant the liberation and the humanization of man which is desired by philosophy and has hitherto been attempted by mere contemplation is achievable only when the proletariat, that is, that part of mankind which is most radically prevented through its social position from developing its humanity and appropriating the humanized reality, is, quote, abolished, end quote. Conversely, the, quote, proletariat cannot be abolished without a realization of philosophy, end quote. Bloch. Assuming Marx. Shit. The proletariat's emancipation and self-abolition as a class is considered identical with the self-realization of humanity or the realization of the liberation which is sought in all philosophy. Grope does not speak further of this conclusion. Grope argues instead as follows, that is, against Ernst Bloch, Quote, faced with such confusion, we must observe in materialistic terms that not only every philosophy originates from social practice, but that every significant philosophy also plays a practical role, exercises a class function, and to that extent is constantly, quote, transformed into practice, end quote. In this respect, there is no difference between pre-Marxist and Marxist philosophy, end quote. R.O. Grope. One is bound, however, to ask how R.O. Grope reconciles this astonishing observation with Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Quote, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in different ways. The point is to change the world, end quote. R.O. Grope evidently recognizes the essential difference between R.O. Grope evidently recognizes the essential difference between contemplation, which aims merely to alter the consciousness and which certainly has specific effects on the practical conduct of individuals, and the direct achievement of self-consciousness by a class which is transcending into revolutionary practice and which, according to Marx, must have a historical effect not through the alteration of consciousness, but through a conscious alteration of its own being. R.O. Grope, however, indulges in a polemic against the young Marx because he must defend his function as an ideologist of the pseudo-Marxist state which has become totalitarian. R.O. Grope therefore states that, quote, philosophy is not ... abolished through its new relationship with practical life, but on the contrary is perfected through this relationship, end quote. For him, Marxism is not the, quote, realization, end quote, of philosophy and through collective action. For R.O. Grope, Marxism is not the, quote, realization, end quote, of philosophy in and through collective action, the revolutionary practice of the proletariat, but a new and higher form of philosophy. Quote, dialectical and historical materialism have therefore represented a further and higher development of philosophy, end quote. In spite of R.O. Grope. Now I'm getting self-conscious that I'm saying R.O. Grope wrong. Yes, it's R.O. For some reason I was thinking it was R.A. for a second, but it's R.O. In spite of all the emphasis on differences in content, this Soviet ideologist rejects the decisive difference perceived by Marx. For R.O. Grope, and for others like R.O. Grope, Marxism has become a philosophical instrument of integration, with the task of processing the knowledge of science and the experiences and necessities of political practice of the party leadership into a uniform philosophical system which must naturally be, quote, open, end quote, so that it can be adopted to given requirements. This pragmatic, quote, openness, end quote, has of course nothing to do with the creative openness and freedom of men who have come into their own, which is worked out by Bloch, and of which Marx dreamed. In sociological terms, the conversion of Marxism into an integrative Weltanschauung worldview corresponds exactly to the function of the all-powerful socialist state, which it in fact serves to justify and strengthen. The Soviet ideology of today differs as much from Marx's philosophy and from the, quote, Aufhebung, end quote, of the latter through realization of concrete freedom, as the modern Soviet state differs from the classless society, a state of new kind instead of the preparation for the disappearance of the state, a higher philosophy instead of the realization of the hopes of the, quote, Aufhebung, end quote, of philosophy after Hegel, and finally the open talk of a proletarian ideology, instead of the liberation of men from all ideological illusions. Such are the characteristics of this trend. Any system, of course, can, of course, be given the name of Marxism, but then people should at least show enough honesty to publicly dissociate themselves from the historical Marx and Marxist humanism. Section E, in defense of Hegel's importance for Marx. Soon after the appearance of the treatise by Grope, which we have just examined, the editors of the Deutsche Zeitschrift für Philosophie in East Berlin opened a discussion on the relationship between Hegel and Marxism. It looks like that discussion featured Augusta Cornu, Fritz Behrens, Wolfgang Schubart, Erhard Albrecht, Wolfgang Munke, and Josef Schleifstein, Helmut Seidel und Klaus Gebler, Joachim Hübner, Iring Fetscher, Jürgen Kuczynski, Wolfgang Harrich. The discussion was then brought to an end without any specific statement to the effect by the editors, as in the case of two other discussions organized by this journal. Sorry, I don't know if I said that was a footnote, but that was a footnote. They specifically chose three sets of questions which required clarification. 1. The relationship between Marxist dialectical method and the idealistic dialectics of Hegel. 2. The progressive and reactionary aspects of classical German philosophy, and in particular that of Hegel. 3. The advantages and faults of recent works whose authors claim to examine problems falling within the framework of this discussion on a Marxist basis, reference being made in the first instance to the books by Lukacs and Bloch on Hegel, which have been discussed as to the studies of the young Marx by Cornu and Behrens. Since the periodical was edited by Wolfgang Harrich and his friend Manfred Hertwig, it can be assumed that Otto Grope's work was brought into the discussion only in order to subject its excessively biased nature to detailed criticism. The two, quote, accused, end quote, Cornu and Behrens, open the discussion. The two, quote, accused, end quote, those who were accused, Cornu and Behrens, opened the discussion with an extremely energetic attack on Otto Grope's presentation of Hegel and Marx and his critique, while at the same time recognizing his laudable intentions. So we could Alright. Where am I? In this connection, Cornu goes in for a certain measure of, quote, autocriticism, end quote, but then, with the backing of his superior knowledge of the facts, he turns specifically against Grope's picture of Hegel and against the erection of an impassable wall between Hegel and Marx. Augusta Cornu emphasizes above all the significance for Marx of Hegel's anthropology, which he developed in the phenomenology of spirit, while Grope asserted, quote, the thought is absurd that Hegel, who was neither a materialist nor a socialist, could have constructed his dialectics on any form of insight into the role of real labor in the history of mankind, end quote. Otto Grope. Cornu summarizes the essential ideas which Marx took over from Hegel as follows. A. Labor is the essence of man and the history of mankind. B. Labor consists in an alienation and reappropriation of human forces. C. Man should be on his own and the product of his labor. Cornu admittedly recognizes that it is necessary to combat, quote, idealistic distortions, end quote, of Marxism, but he considers totally false Otto Grope's assumption that, quote, the observation of a line running back from Marxist philosophy to that of Hegel is an idealistic distortion, end quote. His critique seems to him to originate from unhistorical and dogmatic thought, not from a, quote, historical and organic philosophy, end quote, developed by Hegel and Marx. Cornu, a French university lecturer on the history of culture who has also taught in Berlin, cannot follow the Stalinist mythologues of the class war. Friedrich Behrens finds it equally easy to reject the condemnations pronounced against him in Lukacs. Friedrich Behrens emphasizes that the aspect of Hegel's thought, which Behrens has chosen to concentrate on, the confrontation with classical English political economy, has hitherto remained almost unnoticed, but must be recognized as an indisputable fact. A thorough analysis would have had to check the quotations from Hegel which are cited and interpret the quotations from Hegel which were cited, clearly in the general context of his philosophy, possibly also making reference to other points which contradict these mentioned by Behrens. Otto Grope, however, was more concerned with rejecting the quote opponent end quote than with understanding and convincing. Wolfgang Schubart, Erhard Albrecht, and Wolfgang Muncke also reject Grope's simplifications. Schubart is primarily concerned with the correct evaluation of Hegel and seeks to defend, quote, the achievements of the classical German philosophy, end quote, which were negated by Grope, while Erhard Albrecht deals with the relationship between Hegel and Marx and defends Lukacs against Grope's criticisms. He considered that Lukacs' book is, quote, one of the most important attempts at a creative and critical examination of the classical German heritage, end quote. I'll try looking up some of these people. Wolfgang Schubart doesn't really say anything. Not really seeing anything. Erhard Albrecht. Wikipedia says Erhard Albrecht, who lived from 1925 to 2009, was a German Marxist philosopher who taught at Greifswald. It says that the son of an animal breeding inspector and dairy operator, Albrecht attended the secondary school in Landsberg, Warta, and was drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1943. After a war injury, Albrecht was able to take up a philosophy degree at the University of Rostock in November 1944 after completing his Abitur in Landsberg, which he completed in 1949 with a Dr. Rare poll under Hermann Duncker. After the war, Erhard Albrecht became a member of the KPD, the German Communist Party, and with the forced merger of the SPD and the KPD in 1946, a member of the SED. Erhard Albrecht attended the party college in Kleinmachnow until 1950 and qualified as a professor the following year in Rostock. In 1952, Erhard Albrecht became professor for dialectical and historical materialism, Marxism at the Ernst Moritz Arndt University of Greifswald. In the following years, Erhard Albrecht worked as visiting professor at the universities of Jena and Rostock, among others, and as vice editor. After the university reform until his retirement in 1990, he was head of the Working Group for Methodology, Semiotics, and Communication Science. Erhard Albrecht died on the 9th of May 2009 in Greifswald as his son, Dr. Klaus Albrecht, reported in an obituary. Even after 1990, Erhard Albrecht remained chairman of the Greifswald Semiotics Working Group. And Wolfgang Muncke. What? This stupid thing, dude. And I'm not seeing anything for Wolfgang Muncke. It says that Wolfgang Muncke lived from 1927 to 1986 and was a German historian, Marx Engels researcher, and editor. Yeah, it's just kind of like generic biographical information, like the last one, which I read out loud, and it was kind of unnecessary. Anyway, back to the text. Most of the really philosophical considerations to appear in his study, without, however, conveying a deeper picture of Hegel and Marx. Albrecht objects, for example, to the evaluation of Hegelian dialectics as, quote, pre-Kantian dogma, end quote, as was the conclusion, for example, of Heinrich Schulze, and emphasized that a, quote, equation of the sensualist mechanical theory of cognition with the Marxist or Hegelian theory of reflection, testifies to an unwillingness to understand the Marxian Hegelian theory of cognition. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says Heinrich Schulze lived from 1884 to 1956 and was a German Protestant theologian, philosopher, and logician who supported the neo-positivistic scientific worldview, applying it, however, to a scientific metaphysics as well. Heinrich Schulze helped to establish the academic field, quote, mathematical logic and foundational research, end quote, claiming the priority of language construction and semantics in order to solve fundamental problems even outside mathematics. Heinrich Schulze was also the driving force behind the institutionalization of mathematical logic and foundational research in Germany, and a pioneer in the historiography of logic. End footnote. This comment on the social democratic philosopher Siegfried Mark could, however, directly be applied to the contemporary Soviet ideologists who stand for a naive form of realism following on from Engels and Lenin. Siegfried Mark lived from 1889 to 1957 and was a German Jewish philosopher and representative of liberal social democracy. Albrecht has not developed his own, back to the text, Albrecht has not developed his own concept of the Hegelian Marxian theory of cognition, and he merely emphasizes in this connection that Hegel also called for, quote, insight into the inherent movement of the thing itself, end quote, and in no way established a principle of wild constructivism as Aro Grope suggests. In his subsequent detailed polemic against the dissertation by Heinrich Popitz, Der entfremdete Mensch, Zeitkritik und Geschichtsphilosophie des jungen Marx, whom he accused of, quote, intentional distortion and falsification of Marxism, end quote, Erhard Albrecht seeks to clear himself of the suspicion of Hegelianizing deviation from the general line. I'm not sure if this is who is being referred to, but it probably is. Heinrich Popitz, who lived from 1925 to 2002, was a German sociologist who worked towards a general sociological theory alongside thinkers like Helmut Schelsky and Hans Paul Barth, Dieter Claessens, and others. He was one of those sociologists in post-war Germany who founded their sociological reflections on insights from philosophical anthropology, thus creating an alternative to the then dominant paradigms of the Frankfurt School and Cologne School around René Koenig. His work revolves around four central concepts: power, norms, technology, and creativity. Back to the text. While Helmut Seidel and Klaus Gabler, working from Lenin's statement, quote, clever idealism is closer to clever materialism than stupid materialism, dialectical idealism instead of clever metaphysical undeveloped, dead, rough, immovable, instead of stupid, end quote. Seek to set a higher evaluation than Otto Grope on the importance of Hegel for dialectical materialism. Jürgen Kaczynski draws attention once again to the famous paragraph 243 and 244 in Hegel's Philosophy of Right, in which a very realistic description is given of the dialectical dynamism of bourgeois society. In my own contribution, I attempted to find the basic intentions of Lukacs' book and his main thesis in face of Grope's distortions and the criticism by Josef Schleifstein, which is made in the same spirit. There's a footnote that I missed. At the end of the discussion, Albrecht engaged upon a vigorous polemic against the various works, including my own. The faithfulness to the party line, which Albrecht then showed, is surely held to make up for his, quote, deviations, end quote, in the article under discussion here. And footnote. New section. More Stalinist arguments. The authors mentioned hitherto all oppose Grope's work. We are more interested in the authors who declare solidarity with Grope and support his own polemic. The statements by the, quote, critical commission of the working group of French communist philosophers, end quote, which adopts a definitely Stalinist position, is not directly connected with Grope's contribution. Their study takes as its motto the statement of Zhdanov, quote, the problem of Hegel has long since been solved, end quote. This paper, therefore, does not set out to throw new light on Hegelian philosophy and its relationship with Marx, but is concerned exclusively with Neo-Hegelianism in France, represented by authors such as Kojève, Hippolyte, Merleau-Ponty, Fetscher, Niel, and so on, which is defined as an ideological expression of the now imperialistic bourgeoisie. I obviously know who Kojève, Hippolyte, and Niel. Never heard of Fetscher. The primitive cliches used here are in crass opposition to the often philosophically significant works of independent French Hegelians and Marxists. Finally, it is stated that, quote, the great return to Hegel is only a despairing attack on Marx, which is conducted in the specific form adopted by revisionism in the final crisis of imperialism, a revisionism with a fascist character, end quote. There's a footnote here. It's that I missed. In an article which appears after the conclusion of the discussion, zu einigen irrigen Auffassungen des Übergangs von Hegel auf Marx, Joachim Hoppner rejected my defense of Lukacs as an expression of a bourgeois philosophy, although he was subsequently forced to admit that similar ideas could be found in Kaczynski and indeed even in Palmiro Togliatti. Originally also planned as a contribution to the discussion of the relationship between Hegel and Marx, and published in the subsequently withdrawn number 5 of the same year, after the article by Harach had appeared in the discussion column, Hoppner does me the honor of placing me with G.A. Vetter as a, quote, miniature anti-papist Jesuit, end quote. So, end of that footnote. This attempt to, quote, unmask, end quote, the ideological character of Neo-Hegelianism in France is even less convincing when we know that Kojève, at least at the time of his lectures on Hegel, was decidedly a Marxist-Leninist, with Merleau-Ponty even defended the Moscow trials in Humanisme et Terreur, and Hippolyte, to say the least, is not hostile to Marxism. The return to Hegel can also be defined as a specifically French post-war phenomenon, but it is in no way characteristic of the whole, quote, capitalist world, end quote. The Hegelian, quote, Robinsonade, end quote, the dialectics of mastery and slavery, is presented as a particularly harmful factor, while Erhard Albrecht justly mentioned it as one of the most realistic and valuable aspects of the phenomenology of spirit. When finally the, quote, mystifying significance, end quote, of Hegelian dialectics is summed up, one is tempted to ask whether this is not an unconscious self-portrait of the Stalinist system. The committee concluded, quote, it is no longer sufficient today simply to take up again the statement of Marx that dialectics in dialectics mystified form is again in fashion because it seems to pronounces sacred what already exists, because it allows slavery to be perversely defined as freedom, exploitation as the general good, police measures and war as a defense of the human personality. We must go much further and recognize the real origin of mystified dialectics in violence and war. End quote. The committee. I don't forget what it's called. The French. What was it called again? The Critical Commission of the Working Group of the French Communist Philosophers. Joseph Schleifstein is the strongest defender of Arrow Group and would even like to see the latter's polemic extended to a series of, quote, contributions to the Deutsche Zeitschrift für Philosophie, end quote. Joseph Schleifstein is presumably thinking of the many contributions of Ernst Bloch and Georg Lukacs, in addition to those of Wolfgang Harrich, who is mentioned by name. Lukacs and Fritz Behrens are repeatedly criticized for, quote, ascribing merits to Hegel which he definitely does not possess at the expense of Marx, end quote. Schleifstein particularly dislikes the, quote, supposed relationship between their problems and the parallel between the origins of Hegelian and Marxist dialectics, end quote, as shown by Lukacs. It is suggested that Lukacs arrived at the assertion of this parallelism only by taking the young Marx instead of the, quote, mature, end quote, philosopher as his point of comparison, a choice which was, however, materially determined and justified by the question of the origin of dialectical thought in Hegel and Marx. Schleifstein gives clear expression here to his dislike of the young and not yet Marxist thinker Marx. Quote, by reducing the relationship between Marx and Hegel to the economic and philosophical manuscripts to such categories as alienation and reification, which certainly played a part in the formative period of Marxism but do not exhaust the content of Marxism, the impression of a close relationship between Hegel and Marx is heightened, partly unintentionally. It appears then as if almost all problems and questions raised by Marxists were prepared or already present in essence in Hegel's philosophy, end quote. Joseph Schleifstein. Emphasis on the significance of the young Marx assists the bourgeois attempts to change Marx into a Hegelian. Reference is again made here to Heinrich Poppett's book. In order to counter these supposed falsifications, Schleifstein now calls not for a thorough and scientifically correct examination of the works of the young Marx, but on the contrary for the greatest reserve in dealing with these publications. Quote, this attack and the related reactionary attempts to play down Marx's scientific performance ... cannot be seriously combated when the Marxists concentrate all their attention on the starting point of Marx's development and his spiritual origins, but do not examine the result doctrines and dialectical categories of Marxism in all its component parts. If they do not compare all of Marxism-Leninism with Hegelian philosophy, and demonstrate the great superiority of the scientific Marxist philosophy over that of Hegel. Joseph Schleifstein. We can see once again that the real enemy is not so much Hegel as the young Marx, whose humanism is perhaps secretly felt by Schleifstein and others as a reproach against the political and social order in the USSR and the Soviet bloc. It is true that Marx's doctrine contains more than an analysis of the alienation of man in the capitalist world, but these analyses still form the starting point for the humanistic side of his critique in Capital, the book, and the decisive motive for the doctrine of the necessity of socialist revolution. Jean Hippolyte has clearly shown that this philosophical basis pointed the way for all Marx's work and specifically was never abandoned by Marx. If the essence of Marxism is no longer seen in the emancipation of man and the overcoming of alienation, but in the working out of a, quote, scientific philosophy, end quote, the value emphasis must also shift. In place of the decisive conflict between Marx and Hegel, that is, this conflict between contemplative intellectualized philosophy and active material practice, revolutionary practice, we then have a conflict between two philosophies. The real difference has become smaller and must therefore be asserted all the more vociferously. The fact that Schleifstein's criticism is directed against Marxist humanism and not against Hegel is completely clear from his polemic against Lukacs' thesis of the humanistic bourgeois inheritance of Marxism. Lukacs' attempt to make the, quote, valuable heritage, end quote, of classical bourgeois literature a fertile and living aid for the communist world was sharply rejected in its day by his Hungarian party comrades, as in the Soviet Union, also attempted to bridge the gap between Marxism and the humanist tradition in philosophy. Lukacs writes as follows in his book on Hegel, quote, proletarian humanism grows out of the last great ideological crisis of bourgeois thought, just as the class war of the proletariat itself gradually grew from struggles of the suppressed and exploited classes to achieve liberation, just as there is no ... Great Wall of China between the bourgeois, democratic, and proletarian revolution, just as the proletarian revolution developed very slowly and gradually with many contradictions out of the wars of liberation of the repressed strata of society in all class wars. The special nature of the contradictions in the last great period of crisis in the ideological development of bourgeois society, 1789 to 1848, is therefore in every respect the ideological starting point, the immediate connecting link for the new philosophy of the proletariat. End quote. Georg Lukács, der junge Hegel, the young Hegel. Just as the proletarian revolutionary movement arose from the bourgeois movement, so proletarian humanism can, in other words, be seen in the heritage of bourgeois humanism. Lukács was concerned with this particular link and always emphasized that the superiority of Marxism consists in being able actually to achieve the freedom which remains purely ideal in the bourgeois state. On the other hand, Schleifstein shows that this, quote, external continuity, end quote, hides a deep conflict, against which one might easily object that it is rather the conflict which is external, while the continuity, humanism which must be achieved, is concealed, and is basically the important factor. It is certainly not by chance that in this connection Schleifstein makes reference to Joseph Stalin, who, quote, in his notes on a textbook of modern history, considers the notion of the magnitude of the difference and contradiction between the bourgeois and socialist revolution as the guiding light, the red thread which runs through all modern history, end quote. It is characteristic that Stalin, who was not unjustly considered by Trotsky as the representative of the new Soviet upper stratum, emphasized so vigorously the basic difference between the bourgeois and proletarian revolution. One may in fact justly ask how the October Revolution can be considered as a proletarian socialist revolution. Raymond Aron once defined it as an anti-feudal revolutionary movement which was borne along by a small proletariat and a petite bourgeois and peasant mass, as well as a group of professional revolutionaries whose ideology, it is true, was proletarian and socialist, but whose revolutionary aim was initially not the social ownership of the means of production, but of the private property of the peasants. It was only with the collectivization of agriculture in the years 1928 to 30, which Stalin himself described as a, quote, revolution from above, end quote, that created a socialist basis in the Soviet Union, and when this second silent but nonetheless bloody phase of the revolution is taken into account, a basic difference certainly comes to light between the bourgeois and socialist revolutions. While the French bourgeoisie expropriated the feudal nobility and took over land ownership for themselves, the Soviet bureaucracy expropriated the peasants and took control of agricultural production. With the best will in the world, however, the relationship between the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the French Revolution of 1789 cannot be compared with the relationship between proletarian and bourgeois revolution as outlined by the young Marx. The concretization and realization of the purely programmatic catchwords of the bourgeois revolution is lacking here. Therefore, emphasis is placed on the contradiction between the philosophies and not so much on a real superiority, which is impossible to prove in detail, of Soviet economy and of the concrete freedom which it grants over the formal freedom in bourgeois states. In place of the, quote, Aufhebung end quote, overcoming, elevating, and surpassing at the same time of Hegelianism by practical experience appears the theoretical struggle against an ideological system which is felt as a competitor. Schleifstein summarizes the task of Marxist philosophy by stating that they, quote, fight energetically against all Hegelianization of Marxism and fight against all attempts to heighten the merits of Hegel at the expense of Marx, end quote. In an undialectical manner, Schleifstein seeks to criticize strongly, quote, all that is reactionary, conservative, idealistic, mystical, and Hegelian philosophy, and to, quote, exploit materialistically all that points the way to the future, end quote. In a similar manner, Proudhon, who Marx therefore subjected to annihilating criticism in his Poverty of Philosophy of 1846, wanted to suppress the negative aspects of capitalism and retain only the positive. Lukacs understood the development from Hegelianism to historical materialism as the ideal expression of the transition from the bourgeois democratic to the proletarian social revolution, a transition through which not only the, quote, ideology, end quote, is radically transformed, but also its function changed in principle, since it coincides with the, quote, revolutionary practice, end quote, and therefore also proves the fact that it has been able to grasp the totality of society. New section. G. After the 20th Party Congress. The 20th Party Congress of the USSR Communist Party. The 20th Party Congress of the USSR Communist Party from February 14th to 15th, 1956 came between the article by Joseph Schleifstein, fall 1955, and the fragmentary publication by Wolfgang Harek, fall 1956. The movement of the Soviet Communists away from Stalin, which was completed at this Congress, and the criticism of the personality cult led, as it is well known, to a widespread relaxation of cultural life in Soviet Russia and a number of Eastern Bloc states. Wolfgang Harek and Ernst Bloch were among the leading exponents of this trend until the development of the uprising in Hungary, and the thesis that it was the work of the Hungarian neo-fascism presented the advocates of an intransigent party course in East Germany with a welcome pretext for putting an end to the cultural thaw. Yeah, and people say, like, this is kind of a thing that you'll see in, like, Isaac Deutscher and other people, especially Isaac Deutscher, but this, in his case, particularly, like, 53 at least, but Isaac Deutscher viewed these, like, the actual, working-class self-activity in the Eastern Bloc as represented, for instance, the revolt in East Germany in 1953 and the revolt in 1956, as, like, you know, putting the brakes on a liberalization that was to be achieved from a liberalization and democratization of Soviet society that was ostensibly in the process of being achieved from above. Not to say that it seems like fuck, I'm spacing out. Fetscher is putting a distance between himself and this thesis, but that's just a side note for myself. Harek's contribution to the discussion is by far the boldest and most radical. Wolfgang Harek is not satisfied with rejecting the one-sidedness and logical failings of Otto Grope, but also directly attacks Otto Grope's sources, Stalin, the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, and Zhdanov. Wolfgang Harek demonstrates thoroughly and with detailed evidence the absurdity of the theory of the reactionary character of Hegel's philosophy, making reference to the fact that a number of recent Soviet Russian works have already turned away from this theory and reached a more correct estimate of Hegel as a philosopher of the bourgeois era. Footnote. Above all, the essay by I. Chelyabinsk, Der zur Einschätzung des philosophischen Erbes Hegel, in Communist, 1956, 17, which Harek may have read in the Russian original or in the manuscript of the translation. It was first published in German in April 1957 in the periodical Sowjetwissenschaft Gesellschaft Wissenschaftlicher Beträge. Chelyabinsk moderates the extreme condemnation of Hegel and opposes the, quote, nihilistic attitude to Hegel and his dialectical method, end quote, referring to the 20th Party Congress and the measures taken to eliminate the effects of the personality cult. Chelyabinsk specifically asked for the correction of the model judgment on Hegel's philosophy as an expression of the aristocratic reaction to French materialism and the ideas of the French Revolution. This formulation had found its way not only the great Soviet encyclopedia, but the short philosophical dictionary. In principle, however, Chelyabinsk does not go beyond traditional Leninism and considers the Hegelian system as a kind of quarry in which useful categories can be found for the dialectical materialistic philosophical system. The same applies to the official textbooks of Marxism-Leninism, which have since been published. The Principles of Marxist Philosophy, issued by the Institute for Philosophy of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and the work of Klaus, Kosing, and Redlov, Wissenschaftliche Weltanschauung, which is due to be published in sections, the first of which was issued in 1959, in spite of the tribute to the merits of Hegel, which will be found in both works. The eclectic procedure and traditional formulas of the reactionary system and revolutionary method are still encountered. Hegel's logic is held in high esteem in that it contains, quote, the categories of dialectical materialism, end quote. On the other hand, the absence of a theory of the evolution of nature, and this is a new point of criticism, the, quote, Europocentric, end quote, thought in the philosophy of history, as well as the doctrine of the inevitability of war, come in for strong condemnation. Finally, neo-Hegelianism is accused of, quote, lending new vigor to all the negative aspects contained in the Hegelian system, end quote. In the German textbook, the main praise centers on Hegel's encyclopedic spirit, but the remainder of the tribute consists merely of a scanty indication of the content of his system and a note on his idealism. Politically, we are told that Hegel's philosophy became a, quote, justification for the reactionary conditions in Prussia, end quote, because it asserted that historical development had culminated in his own age. There can be no question of a reason to praise the relationship between Hegel and Marx in this work. End footnote. The rejection of the Hegelian heritage could be traced back to the cult of Stalin, which led to an uncriticizing acceptance of the latter's well-known statement made in the year 1941, and also to the, quote, vulgarizing trends in Zhdanov's speech to Moscow's Conference of Philosophers in June 1947. Zhdanov's assertion that the, quote, problem of Hegel has been solved, end quote, is rejected as a definitive dogmatization of Stalin's statement made during the war. Hayek knows that he remains within the framework of Marxism with his efforts to arrive at a correct understanding of Hegel, that is, of Marxism as Marx and Lenin understood it. Quote, when we try to reestablish Marx and Lenin's picture of Hegel and to remove the sectarian incorrect judgments of the Stalinist era, this implies a return to a stricter Marxist orthodoxy, ... end quote. While the Stalinists wished to make the transition from Hegel to Marx impossible, Hayek hopes precisely by showing the revolutionary sides in Hegel's thought to facilitate the transition to Marxism for bourgeois intellectuals. Quote, many philosophically interested intellectuals in Germany have been unaware for years of the fact that the acceptance of the French Revolution has a decisive and effective influence on the most abstract problems considered by Fichte and Hegel, end quote. The realization could only be given by Marxist historians of philosophy. Footnote. See, however, the thorough and comprehensive representation of the relationship between Hegel and the French Revolution in Joachim Ritter's Hegel and die Französische Revolution. Joachim Ritter was a German philosopher and founder of the so-called Ritter school of liberal conservatism. So where am I? The use to which Wolfgang Hart tries to put this historical example consists, however, in showing that, quote, today progress in philosophy, if the leading productive thinkers of the period do not adopt a positive attitude towards the socialist revolution, is as impossible as it would have been for the progressive performance of German idealism to be achieved at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries without Fichte's decision in favor of the Jacobins and the philosophical evaluation of the results of the French Revolution in the Napoleonic period by Hegel, end quote, Wolfgang Hartog. Hart's practical tendency therefore aims to win bourgeois intellectual sympathizers for the October Revolution and Soviet communism. This trend also formed the basis for his efforts, like those of Ernst Bloch, to interpret Marxist philosophy in a manner suitable to meet higher requirements, and to that extent both could be tolerated by the SED, Socialist Unity Party equal to East German Communist Party, leadership, at least for a short time. The position changed, however, at the moment when this deeper interpretation of Marx itself won influence in the camp of the SED, quote, party comrades, end quote, and built up a link with concrete political and economic notions. It was then a matter of indifference to the party leadership whether such consequences of the theory were already drawn by the thinkers themselves or only by their disciples. Lukacs made his services available to the Imre Nagy. I'm not sure how to say that guy's name. Imre Nagy. Let's see how they say it in Hungarian. Take out some of the guesswork. I look other things up. Hungarian to English. And the internet's out. Lukacs made his services available to Nagy's government as Minister of Culture, while Wolfgang Hartog tried to bring about a kind of, quote, Polish October, end quote, in East Germany, to the extent that the manifesto published in the press has given us information on this point. Fritz Behrens hoped for an economic political model approaching the Yugoslavian example. The leading party ideologists, however, related all these concepts to deviationary ideas of their authors. When an attempt was made to turn the human side of Marxism to practical use instead of merely theorizing for propaganda purposes, the party leadership acted piteously. Footnote. Since then, the vigor of the polemic against Bloch and Lukacs has increased still further. For example, at the 33rd plenary session of the SED, there was a vigorous debate in which Kurt Hager sought to clear himself of the suspicion that he had not been radical enough in the position he adopted against Ernst Bloch. The, quote, leader of the section for German affairs, end quote, in the Central Committee, Paul Ferner, stated, e.g., quote, he, Bloch, said that, quote, freedom and truth are concepts defining humanity's home place. The practice of freedom in the socialism is the socialism of freedom, end quote. In other words, Bloch advocates the free socialism which is proclaimed by the right-wing social democratic leaders. Ernst Bloch goes on to state that the, quote, theory of freedom is the Marxism of truth. The immense friendliness of Marxism must be emphasized, bracket, the term, quote, friendliness, end quote, being taken over from the vocabulary of Bertolt Brecht, Iring Fetscher, end quote, end bracket, end quote. Comrades, quote, comrades, this is the theoretical platform of the counter-revolutionary group of Harach and Janka, which aimed to undermine the power of the workers and peasants in the GDR and in the last consequence to eliminate it, ... end quote. Das 33 Plenum des ZK der SED, quoted in the supplement to the weekly Das Parlament. Of the many articles devoted to Bloch, I should simply like to quote Otto Grope's Idealistische Verirrungen unter antidogmatischem Vorzeichen, end quote, in Neues Deutschland of December 19th, 1956. Otto Grope, mystische Hoffnungsphilosophie ist unvereinbar mit Marxismus in Wiss Beilage des Forum. March 2nd, 1957. Kurt Hager, Der Kampf gegen bürgerliche Ideologie und Revisionismus. In Forum number 9-3/4, February 1957. Hermann Ley, Ernst Bloch and das Hegelsche System in Einheit. March 1957. All right. I would summarize the conclusions of this chapter as follows. A distinction must be made between the enmity of the Soviet ideologists for Hegel, quote, struggle against the Hegelianizing interpretation of Marx, end quote, and the aversion to the young Marx and his ethos, which is often concealed behind this enmity. The political motives for this attitude are varied, but nevertheless clearly concentrated on the problem of defending the position of power of the party leadership. 1. All, quote, Hegelianizing influences, end quote, are combated because the party leadership aims to maintain the purity of a uniform and unambiguous interpretation of Marx based on the tradition of Engels and Lenin, so as to guarantee the unity of the Communist Party. For this reason, it cannot abandon its monopoly of interpretation and reserves for itself the final decision against all independent thinkers who define themselves as Marxists, such as Ernst Bloch or Herbert Marcuse. Footnote. Just how little such an institutional dependence of the theoretician on the party organization was to the taste of Engels is apparent from several statements in his correspondence with August Bebel, which was recently published in East Berlin. In his letter of May 1st to 2nd, 1891, Engels writes, e.g., quote, since you have attempted to suppress publication of the article by force and have warned the Neue Zeit that it would probably be taken over by the party and subjected to censorship, if it repeats action, the seizure of ownership of your entire press by the party appears to me in a very strange light. What is the difference between you and Puttkamer if you introduce a socialist law among your own ranks? For me it makes little difference, ... No party can condemn me to silence if I have decided to speak, but I would suggest that it would be preferable for you to be a little less sensitive and rather less Prussian in your actions. You, the party, needs socialist science, and this cannot live without freedom of movement. The party, needs socialist science, and this cannot live without freedom of movement. The unpleasant features have to be accepted, and you can best do that by maintaining your distance, ... It is self-evident that the committee, or you yourself, must have and retain an important moral influence on the Neue Zeit and on everything else which is published, but this can and must be sufficient for you. In Verwärts, we are constantly being told that freedom of discussion must be absolute, but there is little reflection of this in practice. In Vorwärts, we are constantly being told that freedom of discussion must be absolute, but there is little reflection of this in practice. You do not realize how strange this tendency towards violent measures appears to us here abroad, where we are accustomed to seeing the oldest party leaders called to account within their own party, e.g. the Tory government led by Lord Randolph Churchill, ... End quote. Engels' letter to Bebel. 18 months later, Engels spoke out even more clearly, quote, it is a hard lot to be dependent even on a workers' party. It is a hard lot to be dependent even on a workers' party, end quote. November 19th, 1892. Quote, and quite apart from the question of money, it is a barren position for anyone with initiative to be the editor of a party journal. Marx and I always agreed that we would never accept such a position and could only work for a journal financially independent even of the party itself. Your, quote, taking over, end quote, of the press has great evils if it is taken too far. You must definitely have a press in the party which is not directly dependent on the committee and even on the party conference, i.e. which is in a position to oppose individual party measures freely within the program and tactics adopted, and which can also freely criticize the program and tactics within the limits of what is decent in a party, ... The first requirement is a formally independent party press, end quote. It was necessary to quote this passage in detail because it shows clearly that Engels was not concerned with criticism directed exclusively against the, quote, revisionist German party leaders, end quote, as Soviet ideologists will probably soon assert, but with an essential superiority in recognition of the need for a truly independent press within the workers' movement. Lenin, as is well known, did not consider financial dependence on the party as an evil, but on the contrary as a necessary prerequisite for unity within the party and obedience on the part of the, quote, professional revolutionaries, end quote. End footnote. Where am I? 2. Hegel is rejected vigorously as well because, de facto, the Soviet ideology as a closed Weltanschauung system, like the Soviet state and the Soviet notion of freedom in this, quote, highest form of democratic state, end quote, have approximated substantially to the Hegelian example, and the Soviet Union has in practice become a state based on a right-wing Hegelian conception. The apologetic side of Hegelian dialectics is criticized all the more sharply as dialectics was, in fact, used continuously under Stalin to defend the allegedly free and socialist character of the Soviet Union. 3. The young Marx and his humanist ethos are rejected because they represent a constant reproach against the inhuman and unfree political order in the Soviet world. For this reason, an attempt is made to open a gulf between Hegel and Marx, or to compare the two thinkers only in their, quote, mature and developed form, end quote. Josef Schleifstein. Footnote, strictly speaking, the comparison is not between Marx and Hegel, but between the dialectical materialism developed by Engels, Lenin, and so on, and Hegel's idealist system. End footnote. The emphasis placed by the young Marx on a realization of bourgeois humanism, which in bourgeois societies remains imaginary and illusory, is frequently made use of to attract, quote, sympathizing intellectuals, end quote, but must never be allowed to become a concrete factor in politics. Toleration of Bloch and Hegel in a period of relative stability, condemnation when they or their followers begin to draw political consequences for socialist societies from their concepts. 4. The discussions in the 1920s between Lukacs and Korsch on the one hand and the Leninist orthodoxy on the other can be traced back, like the recent polemic against the work of Bloch and Lukacs on Hegel, to the opposition between the leading party bureaucracy and the independent philosophers. The interest of the party leadership necessarily centers on maintaining their dominant position, and it is not by chance that the representatives of the mechanistic technical interpretation have won the day. The interest of philosophers who think relatively independently is directed towards socialism and its human realization, but as well, for example, to a true and deep interpretation of the relationship between Marx and the philosophical tradition. Formulated in even sharper terms, the party leadership is concerned with power and therefore thinks in categories of power. Philosophers are concerned with humanity and understanding, and therefore think, at least some of them do so, in dialectical historical terms. The party leaders understand themselves to be, quote, engineers of power, end quote, while the Marxist philosophers see themselves as dialecticians and hermeneutists who can interpret the meaning of history, which can be grasped only from a humanistic or theological position. Oh, that's parenthesis, or theological and parenthesis position. Henri Lefebvre was aware of this contrast between the party ideologists and the Marxist philosophers. Henri Lefebvre, therefore, demanded spiritual freedom and the independence for the Marxist thinkers, whose task cannot be reduced to propaganda and, quote, popularizing of the classics, end quote. It was part of the essence of Stalinism, however, that such independence could not be tolerated, and philosophy together with the humanities were condemned to remain barren. If you're interested in the history of like the humanities and stuff in and Marxism in the Soviet Union, check out the pieces I have up by James D. White, in particular The Road Towards the Short Course, which is kind of talks about like the consolidation of Stalinist dogma in the Soviet Union on like the ideological level. Footnote: Marek Fritzhand published in Nowe Drogi, New Paths, the central organ of the Polish United Workers' Party, an article on the dispute about the philosophical heritage of the young Marx, which calls for the examination of Marx's early writings not to be left to the revisionists and opponents of Marxism. On the contrary, to a study of the young Marx would, quote, a study of the young Marx would, quote, philosophically enrich, end quote, and, quote, politically strengthen, end quote, the theory. Marek Fritzhand emphasizes that there is no conflict between the position of the early and mature Marx, and that even in the articles of the Deutsche Französische Jahrbucher and in Political Economy and Philosophy, Marx did not follow the ahistorical theory of, quote, true socialism, end quote. Do I have something from Marek Fritzhand on my channel? I might, because I think he might be in the Socialist Humanism Compendium, so Anyway, continuing the footnote, Capital, the book, is all supposed to be marked by ethical categories and to contain a, quote, specific concept of life and morality, end quote. He explains the neglect of the young Marx in the Orthodox Party camp on the one hand is arising from a fear of suspicion of revisionism, and on the other side by the idea that it conceals, quote, certain, in my opinion, erroneous positivistic concepts, bracket, my italics, Iring Fetscher, end bracket, which oppose Marxism to ethics, ... End quote. Fritz Hand therefore indicates specifically the point which I have emphasized as characteristic of the development of Marxism since the age of the Second International. If it is true that on the one hand that the reduction of Marxism to mere ethics is one of the most dangerous results of revisionism, it is equally true that its isolation from a real ethical content can only do harm to Marxism. While the orthodox Marxism in the GDR was While for the orthodox Marxists in the GDR, the young Marxists thought simply to have left, quote, significant documents for the origin and development of Marxism, end quote, D. Bergner and Wolfgang Jahn in der Kreuzzug der Akademien gegen den Marxismus. Fritz Hand sees the philosophical early writings as works which deserve to be studied for their own sake and which enrich the content of Marxism. Here an attempt is made to counter the reduction of Marxism to a positivistic faith in science and pseudoscientific philosophy. I am indebted to Harold Leeuwen, Hanover, for the reference to this article. End footnote. That is the end of the chapter. I know that was long, and I thank you very much for listening.